I had been working on a novel for about 3 years by the fall of 2018, and I was 41 years old that October when I finally took the week off from my day job at a small marketing agency in Charlotte and rented a lake house on a remote reservoir in the western part of North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge country, for the kind of quiet, uninterrupted writing time that I had been telling myself I needed for the better part of 2 years. The reservoir was one of the smaller man-made lakes that had been created in the 1940s, when the Tennessee Valley Authority had dammed up a string of small mountain rivers in that part of the state. It was the kind of lake that had a few scattered private cabins along its shoreline and a small public boat ramp at the south end and not much else. The cabin I rented was on the north end of the lake, in a small cove about 3 miles up the shoreline from the boat ramp, on a piece of property that the owner had told me on the phone had been in his family since the lake was first filled. The owner was a man named Carlton, who lived in Asheville and who managed the rental remotely. He had been polite on the phone. He had asked the standard questions about my plans for the week, had emailed me the rental agreement, had given me the gate code for the gravel road that led down to the cabin, and had told me that the cabin came with a small aluminum john boat tied to the wooden dock at the edge of the cove. He told me I was welcome to use the boat if I wanted to, that the keys were in a small drawer in the kitchen, and that the gas tank had been topped off the previous week. He told me to be careful on the water. He told me the lake was deep in the cove, about 90 feet at the deepest part, and that I should wear a life jacket if I went out alone. He sounded like a careful man who had rented the cabin many times and who had developed the standard set of instructions over the years. I drove up from Charlotte on a Saturday in mid-October. The drive took about 3.5 hours. The fall color was at its peak in the Blue Ridge country that weekend, with the maples and the oaks and the sourwood trees turning in the long, slow way they turn in the southern Appalachians, where the color comes on gradually and lasts for weeks. I reached the gate to the cabin's gravel road at about 3 in the afternoon. I punched in the code. The gate opened. I drove the half-mile of rough gravel down through the trees to the cabin, which sat in a small clearing about 30 feet back from the water. The cabin was a single-story log building with a wide front porch facing the lake and a small wooden dock extending about 20 feet out into the cove. The john boat was tied to the dock, exactly as Carlton had described. I unloaded my groceries. I set up my laptop on the small dining table that faced the lake. I made myself a cup of coffee. I started writing. The first 2 days of the trip went well. I wrote in the mornings, walked the small trail that ran along the shoreline in the afternoons, made simple suppers, and read by the wood stove in the evenings until I got tired enough to sleep. The cabin was quiet in the way that remote lake cabins are quiet, with the small ambient sounds of water lapping against the dock and the occasional call of a hawk or a barred owl in the trees beyond the cove. I did not see another person on either of those days. I did not hear another boat. The lake, in mid-October, was past the summer recreation season and not yet into the late fall fishing season, and the few other cabins I could see from the dock through the trees appeared to be unoccupied. I had the cove to myself. On the third night, I went to bed at about 10:30. I had written for most of the day. I was tired. I fell asleep quickly. I want to describe what woke me very precisely, because I have gone over the moment many thousands of times in the 7 years since. I woke at about 2 in the morning to the sound of an outboard motor starting. The sound was unmistakable. It was the small, distinctive cough and catch of a small 2-stroke gasoline motor coming to life, the kind of sound that anyone who has spent any time on small lakes knows on hearing. The motor caught on the second pull. It settled into the steady, low chugging of a 2-stroke at idle. I sat up in bed. The bedroom of the cabin had a window that faced the lake. The curtains were drawn, but the curtains were thin, and I could see the faint, pale shape of the dock and the cove beyond through the fabric. I held very still. The motor continued to chug at idle for maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard it engage, the small rev as the throttle was opened, and I heard the boat begin to move away from the dock, the sound of the motor receding slowly across the water. The boat was moving slowly, not racing, not at full throttle, moving at the careful low speed of a boat being driven by somebody who knew the lake and who was not in any hurry to be anywhere. I sat in bed and listened. The motor receded across the cove. It traveled, by the sound of it, for maybe 90 seconds. Then it stopped. The motor cut off. The lake was completely silent again. I tried to think. I did not move. I sat in bed and I tried to construct an explanation for what I had just heard. I considered, in the first minute, whether somebody might have come down to the dock and started the boat as some kind of theft. This was unlikely. The cabin was at the end of a half-mile gravel road behind a coated gate. There was no public access to the cove. Anyone who had taken the boat would have had to either come in by water or come down the gravel road past my parked car. I had heard no car. I had heard no other boat approaching. I considered whether Carlton himself might have come down to check on something. This was also unlikely. He lived in Asheville, 3 hours away. He had not mentioned any plans to visit during my rental week, and he would have called or texted me before coming. I got out of bed. I pulled on my jeans and a flannel shirt and my boots. I picked up the heavy flashlight I had set on the bedside table. I walked out through the front room of the cabin to the porch. I stood on the porch and shone the flashlight beam across the cove toward the dock. The dock was empty. The John boat was gone. The rope that had been tying the boat to the dock was still attached to the cleat. The knot was still tied. I walked down the porch steps and along the small path to the dock. I knelt at the cleat. The rope was a standard cleat hitch, the kind I had tied myself when I had checked the boat on my first afternoon. The hitch was still in place, but the boat end of the rope was lying on the dock, neatly coiled, as if somebody had carefully untied it from the boat and laid the line back across the cleat. I want to describe this carefully because it is the detail I have come back to most often in the years since. The rope had not been cut. The rope had not been jerked loose by a boat being driven away with the line still attached. The rope had been untied by a person who knew how to untie a cleat hitch, by a person who had then taken the time to coil the line back onto the dock instead of dropping it in the water, by a person who had been careful and methodical, the kind of person who would do that, and the kind of person who would steal a boat from a stranger's dock at 2 in the morning, did not, in my mind, fit together into a single coherent person. I shone my flashlight across the cove. The beam reached maybe 100 yards before fading into the darkness. The cove was empty. I could see no boat. I could hear no motor. The water was still. I stood on the dock for probably 10 minutes. I considered calling Carlton. It was 2 in the morning. I considered calling the county sheriff. The cabin was on a back road in a county where the sheriff's response time, even in the daytime, was probably 45 minutes. I made a small, careful decision to wait. I walked back up to the porch. I sat in one of the rocking chairs. I kept the flashlight in my lap. I waited. The cabin had no neighbors I could see through the trees. The cove was completely dark except for the small light I had left on in the cabin's front room. The night was cold, in the way October nights in the Blue Ridge country are cold once the sun is down. I could see my breath in the air. I sat in the rocking chair and I listened to the lake. I could hear the small ambient sounds of water, the occasional distant call of a barred owl, the rustle of leaves in the trees behind the cabin. I could not hear an outboard motor. I could not hear any boat at all. At about 4 in the morning, I heard a small sound on the water. Not a motor. A soft, slow lapping, like the small wake of a boat moving very slowly through still water. I stood up. I shone my flashlight across the cove. The beam picked up the John boat, drifting in slowly from the dark water at the mouth of the cove, about 50 yards from the dock. The boat was moving in a straight line toward the dock. It was not under power. The motor was not running. There was no person in it. The boat was empty. I want to describe what I saw very precisely. The aluminum hull of the John boat was slightly tilted, the way a small boat tilts when it is moving slowly under inertia rather than under power. The bow was pointed directly at the dock. The boat was tracking a perfectly straight line. There was no current in the cove. There was no wind. The boat was being moved by something that was not visible to me, in the direction of the dock where it had been tied, at a speed that suggested it would arrive at the dock within maybe 2 minutes. I stood on the porch, and I watched it come in. I held my flashlight on it the whole time. The boat reached the dock. It did not bump against the wood. It slid in alongside the dock with the careful precision of a boat being landed by an experienced boatman who knew exactly how much speed the boat had and exactly when to let it coast in. The bow nudged the dock at a near zero velocity. The boat came to rest. The bow rope was lying coiled in the bottom of the boat, neatly looped, as if somebody had pulled it in and laid it down before stepping out of the boat at some other dock and then sending it back. I walked down to the dock. I shone the flashlight into the boat. The seat of the boat was wet. I want to be precise about this. The seat was not soaked. It was not dripping. It was wet in the particular way that a boat seat is wet after a person has been sitting on it for a while in clothes that have been in contact with water. The wetness was concentrated in the small rectangular area where a person's hips and lower back would have been if they had been sitting on the seat. The wetness spread outward from that area in the small concentric way that water seeps out from a wet patch. The seat had been sat on, recently, by a person whose clothes had been wet. I checked the fuel gauge. The gauge read 3/4 full. I had checked the gauge on my first afternoon. It had read 3/4 full then. The boat had run for 90 seconds when it left the dock, and had then traveled some unknown distance back to the dock without engine power. The fuel level had not changed in any way I could detect. I tied the bow rope back onto the cleat. I tied a careful cleat hitch, the same hitch I had tied on my first day. I shone the flashlight into the empty boat one more time. I walked back up to the cabin. I locked the front door. I locked the back door. I locked the bedroom door, which I had not locked on either of the previous nights. I sat on the bed in the dark with my flashlight in my lap, and I did not sleep until the sun came up. I called Carlton at 8:30 in the morning, the earliest hour at which I felt I could reasonably call him. He picked up on the second ring. I told him, in a careful voice, that I had a question about the boat. I told him what had happened. The motor, at 2 in the morning, the empty dock, the rope coiled on the cleat, the boat coming back at 4, the wet seat, the fuel gauge unchanged. I did not embellish. I told him the events in the order they had happened. There was a long silence on the line. Carlton was quiet for what felt like a full 30 seconds. Then he said, in a careful voice, "Are you still planning to stay the rest of the week?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "I am not going to charge you for the rest of the week. The rental is paid through Saturday. If you want to leave today, that is fine. I will not put any of this in any rental record." I said, "Carlton, has this happened before?" He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I would prefer not to discuss the boat. I would prefer to leave that to your judgment about whether you want to be in the cabin tonight. I will say this. The boat has been at that dock for many years. It does what it does. I have not put any of this in writing. I would appreciate it if you did not either." I said, "All right." I packed my things. I left the cabin by 1 in the afternoon. I drove back to Charlotte. I did not go down to the dock again. I did not look at the boat as I drove out. In the 7 years since, I have not been back to that cabin. Carlton's listing was taken off the rental websites about a year after my stay. The cabin is, as far as I can tell from the satellite images, still there. The dock is still there. The John boat is still tied to the dock. I have not contacted Carlton again. I have not told my wife about that night, who I met in 2020 and married in 2022. I have a small framed photograph on the wall of my home office, taken on my second afternoon at the cabin, of the John boat tied to the dock in the late afternoon light, with the fall color reflected on the still water of the cove. I have not been able to bring myself to take it down. I look at it sometimes. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that whoever was using the boat that night was not lonely, that the trip across the cove and back was a small private thing they had been doing for a long time, and that they did not particularly need me to be in the cabin and did not particularly mind that I had been. I have hoped that the seat is not wet anymore. I have hoped that nobody else has rented that cabin and gone down to the dock at 4 in the morning to find an empty boat coming in straight and slow from the dark water. I do not know whether to believe any of those hopes. I have not gone back. I do not intend to. The boat is at the dock. It is doing what it does. I have left it alone, where it has been waiting, and where I hope it stays. I had been spending every July at my family's lake house in eastern Tennessee since I was a small child, and I was 34 years old in the summer of 2019 when I brought my husband Marcus to the lake for the first time, 6 months after our wedding. The lake was a small reservoir in the Blue Ridge country of East Tennessee, one of the smaller lakes that the Tennessee Valley Authority had created in the 1940s when the agency had dammed up a string of small mountain rivers in that part of the state. My great-grandfather had bought the small parcel of land on the North Shore in 1948, when the lake was still new and the shoreline lots were cheap, and my grandfather had built the cabin himself in the early 1950s. The cabin had been in our family for 3 generations. My mother had grown up summering there. I had grown up summering there. My older brother and I had learned to swim in the shallows off the dock, had learned to fish from my grandfather's small wooden rowboat, had spent every July of our childhoods in the small particular world of that cove. The cove the cabin sat on was a small inlet on the north shore of the lake, about 3 miles up the shoreline from the public boat ramp. The cove was maybe half a mile across at its widest point, with our dock on the east side and a long undeveloped stretch of forested shoreline on the west side. The west shore of the cove had been undeveloped for as long as I could remember. There was no cabin over there. There was no dock. There was no road in. The land had been part of a large timber company's holdings for most of the 20th century, and the company had never logged that particular piece because the slopes were too steep and the access too poor. By the 1980s, the timber company had sold the land to a regional land conservancy that had agreed to keep it permanently undeveloped. The West Shore was, by every legal and practical measure, a piece of forested mountain land that no person had any reason to be on after dark. I had been telling Marcus about the lake for our entire relationship. I had wanted to bring him to the cabin every summer since we had started dating in 2015, and we had never been able to make the schedule work, and 2019 was the first summer when we had finally been able to take a full week off together in July. We drove down from our apartment in Atlanta on a Saturday morning. Marcus had grown up in Chicago. He had spent very little time in the southern Appalachians. He was fascinated by the slow, steady way the road wound up into the mountains, by the kudzu draped over the older roadside trees, by the way the air got cooler and damper as we climbed up into the country around the lake. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. I gave him the small, careful tour I had been practicing in my head for months. The kitchen, with the original 1950s appliances that my grandfather had installed, and that my mother had never replaced. The screened porch facing the cove. The dock with the small wooden bench at the end where my brother and I had spent thousands of hours of our childhoods. The shed where my grandfather's old rowboat was stored. The small fire ring at the edge of the woods where we had cooked countless suppers over the years. Our first night was quiet and lovely. We made supper on the screened porch. We watched the light fade across the cove. We sat by the fire ring with a bottle of wine until the stars came out. The lake was completely still. I could see, on the far shore of the cove, the dark line of trees coming down to the water, with no light of any kind visible through them. Marcus was charmed. He kept saying he could not believe how dark it got. He kept saying he could not believe how many stars there were. We went to bed at about 10:30, in the upstairs bedroom that had been my room as a child. On the second night, I noticed the light. It was about 9 in the evening. The sun had been down for an hour. We were sitting on the screen porch with our wine glasses, looking out across the cove, when Marcus said, in a casual voice, "Is that a cabin over there?" I looked across the cove. On the far shore, about half a mile away as the crow flew, in the dark line of trees just above the waterline, there was a small, steady, warm light burning. I want to describe the light very precisely, because I have gone over the memory many times in the 6 years since. It was small, maybe the size of a household lamp at that distance. It was warm yellow, the color of a kerosene wick or a candle flame, with no sharp edge, just a soft gradient of brightness fading off into the surrounding darkness. It was steady. It did not flicker. It did not move. It was sitting in one specific point on the far shoreline, and it was burning at one steady level of brightness that did not change. I sat on the screened porch, and I looked at the light for probably a full minute without speaking. Marcus beside me said, "I thought you said there were no cabins over there." I said, "There are no cabins over there." He said, "Well, somebody is over there." I said, "There is no road in. There is no dock. There is no way for anybody to get to that piece of land except by boat, and there are no boats out tonight." Marcus looked at the light. He looked at me. He said, "Maybe somebody is camping. Maybe somebody hiked in." I said, "It is conservancy land. You are not allowed to camp there." He said, "Maybe somebody is camping illegally." I said, "Maybe." The light burned for the rest of the night. Marcus and I went to bed at about 11. I lay in bed with the curtains slightly parted and I watched the light through the bedroom window. It did not move. It did not change. It burned in exactly the same place, at exactly the same brightness, for as long as I watched it, which was probably until 2 or 3 in the morning, when I finally fell asleep. I woke up at about 6 the next morning. The light was still there, still burning, in the gray pre-dawn light. It was not a campfire. Campfires die down at night. They flicker. They produce smoke that catches the morning light. This light did none of those things. It was a steady, warm yellow point that had been burning, by my count, for at least 9 hours. Marcus woke at about 7. We had coffee on the porch. We watched the light fade as the sun came up. By about 7:30, when the morning light was strong enough to make out the far shoreline clearly, the light was no longer visible. The far shore looked exactly as it had looked the day before. A dark line of trees coming down to the water. No cabin, no tent, no fire ring, no sign of any human presence. I told Marcus over breakfast that we should kayak across the cove and check. We had 2 old kayaks in the shed, the kind of plastic recreational kayaks that my parents had bought sometime in the early 2000s, and that we used for paddling around the cove on calm afternoons. We launched them from the dock at about 10 in the morning. The cove was glass still. We paddled across in maybe 20 minutes, the slow, easy way you paddle a recreational kayak in calm water. We landed on the far shore at the spot where the light had been burning. I had triangulated the position carefully against the shape of the trees and against a small, distinctive point of rock that I had been able to see in the dawn light. We pulled the kayaks up onto a small, flat patch of muddy beach. We walked up the shore. The land sloped up steeply from the water into a thick second-growth forest of poplars and hickories and oaks. The ground was covered with leaves and small fallen branches, and the standard, undisturbed forest floor of an undeveloped piece of mountain land. There was no cabin, there was no tent, there was no fire ring, there was no path. There was no clearing of any kind. There was no sign that any human being had ever been on that piece of shoreline. The leaves were undisturbed. There were no footprints. There was no broken vegetation. There was no recent fire ash. There was nothing. Marcus and I walked along the shore for about 100 yards in each direction from the spot where the light had been burning. We checked carefully. We found nothing. We paddled back across the cove. I want to say something about Marcus's reaction. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, an attorney, the kind of person who did not jump to conclusions. He did not suggest that I had been imagining things. He did not try to explain the light away. He sat with me on the screen porch when we got back and he said, in a careful voice, "I do not know what we just saw. I do not have an explanation. I will tell you what I think. I think we should be very careful about that light for the rest of the week." The light burned every night that week. Same place, same color, same steady, unflickering yellow. It started appearing within about an hour of full dark each evening, somewhere around 9 or 9:30. It burned all night. It faded out as the morning light came up, and by 7:30 in the morning it was no longer visible. We did not paddle across again. We sat on the screened porch each evening and we watched it. We sat on the dock. We did not put either of the kayaks back into the water at night. We did not, although I want to admit this carefully, ever discuss what we would have done if we had heard a voice calling from across the cove, or seen any movement near the light, or noticed anything that suggested the light had become aware of us. On the 4th day of the trip, I called my mother. She lived in Knoxville, where I had grown up after my parents had moved off the lake in the early 1990s. My mother was in her late 60s, retired, the kind of practical, sensible woman who had spent her career as a public school librarian and who did not have a superstitious bone in her body. I called her in the late morning when I knew she would be home, and I told her, in a careful voice, that I wanted to ask her something about the cove. I described the light, the steady, warm yellow point on the far shore, the way it burned all night, the way Marcus and I had paddled across and found nothing, the way it had appeared every night since. My mother was quiet on the phone for a long time. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, in a careful voice, "Honey, I saw that light when I was a girl. I saw it the summer I was 11. That would have been 1971. I saw it for 2 weeks straight. My grandmother told me, when I asked her about it, that she had seen it too as a girl in the 1920s. She told me, very seriously, that I was never to row toward it after dark. She told me that the light had been on that shore for as long as her own grandmother had been alive. She told me that families on the lake had a small, careful agreement with each other to leave the light alone. She told me that nobody had ever investigated it from the water at night, and that nobody who had spent any time on the lake had ever wanted to. I said, "Mom," she said, "I have hoped for almost 50 years that the light had stopped. I have asked your father every July when we were at the cabin whether he had seen anything across the cove at night. He had never seen anything. I have not asked your brother. He spends most of his time at the lake during the day. I had stopped going down to the cabin myself after your grandmother passed in 2008. I had hoped, when I asked your father each July, that the answer was no, and the answer was always no, and I had let myself believe that the light had finally gone away. I had not mentioned it to you because I had hoped you would never see it. I am sorry, sweetheart. I should have warned you when you told me you were taking Marcus down." I said, "Mom, what is it?" She said, "I cannot tell you that, honey. I do not know. My grandmother did not know. She told me only that nobody had ever crossed the cove toward it at night, and that nobody who had any sense was going to be the first. She told me that the light had been there for at least 80 years by the time I was a child, and that probably it would still be there long after I was gone. She told me to leave it alone. I am asking you, honey, with all the love I have, to leave it alone. Do not paddle across at night. Do not signal it. Do not call out to it. Pack up at the end of the week and come home, and tell Marcus what I have just told you, and do not go back to the cabin until I am gone. And then you can do whatever you want with the property because it will be yours and your brother's, and I will not have to know." I told her I understood. We did not speak about the light again. I told Marcus that night what my mother had said. He listened carefully. He did not ask many questions. He nodded slowly. We finished out the week. We did not paddle across the cove again. We sat on the screened porch every evening, and we watched the light burn. On our last night, I want to admit something I have not told anyone. I sat on the dock alone for about half an hour after Marcus had gone to bed. I looked across at the light. I tried to see, in the fixed, steady, warm yellow point on the far shore, any indication of what was burning, any movement, any flicker, any sign that something on the far shore was aware of me sitting on the dock. I saw nothing. The light burned. I went inside. I locked the screen door behind me, although I had never locked the screen door at the cabin in my life. In the 6 years since, I have not been back to the cabin. My brother has continued to use it, mostly during the day, mostly with his family, mostly in the spring and the fall when the light, my mother has told me very quietly, has historically been less consistent. My mother has not been back herself since 2008. She is 75 now. She is still in good health. She has told me, in a casual voice, that she would like to live another 10 years before the cabin becomes mine. I have told her I want her to live another 40. The cabin sits on the cove. The light burns on the far shore. I do not know whether it burns every night or only some nights. I have not asked. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the small, careful agreement my grandmother and her grandmother and my mother, and now I have all kept, is enough, that the light is content to burn on its shore for whatever reasons it has, and that whoever or whatever lights the wick of that lantern every evening at full dark on the undeveloped west shore of a small cove in eastern Tennessee, where there is no cabin and no road in and no dock, has not become impatient with the families that have for 4 generations sat on the east shore and watched without crossing. I hope it stays. I hope I never have to know. I had been divorced for about 3 months by October of 2020, and I was 46 years old that fall when I rented a small lake house on a private lake in southwestern Virginia for a long, quiet weekend by myself. The divorce had been the kind of slow, careful divorce that 2 reasonable people produce when they have been gradually unhappy with each other for many years and have finally decided to stop pretending. We had not had children. We had divided the house and the savings without rancor. We had each kept the dog for half the year. The legal proceedings had concluded in late July, and by October, I had been living alone in a small apartment in Roanoke for 2.5 months. And I had reached the point in the process where my therapist had suggested that I take a weekend by myself somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the apartment, where I could think about what I wanted the next 10 years of my life to look like. I had found the lake house on a small rental website that listed cabins in the rural counties of Southwest Virginia. The lake was a small private lake, maybe 80 acres, in a hollow about an hour and a half from Roanoke. It had been created in the 1950s by a wealthy timber company executive who had dammed up a small mountain creek on his own land and had built 4 small cabins around the resulting lake for his family. By the early 2000s, the family had sold the property to a regional rental company that maintained the cabins as off-season retreats for people who wanted quiet weekends in the Blue Ridge country. The lake was not on any public map. The road in was a narrow gravel road behind a coated gate. The cabins were spaced far apart around the shoreline, far enough that you could not see one from another. I drove out on a Friday afternoon in mid-October. The fall color was at its peak in the small mountains around the lake. The drive-in took me up through a narrow hollow that the gravel road had been cut into the side of, with a small, clear creek running alongside the road and the bare beginnings of the leafless season just starting to show in the higher elevations. I reached the gate at about 4 in the afternoon. I punched in the code the rental company had emailed me. The gate opened. I drove the half-mile of gravel road down to the cabin, which sat in a small clearing about 30 feet back from the water on the south shore of the lake. The cabin was a single-story log building with a wide front porch facing the water and a small wooden pier extending about 15 feet out into the lake. The lake was completely calm in the late afternoon light. I could see the other 3 cabins across the water, all of them dark, all of them apparently unoccupied for the weekend. The rental company had told me on the phone that I was the only renter that weekend and that I would have the lake to myself. I unloaded my groceries. I unpacked my small overnight bag in the bedroom. I made myself a simple supper of pasta with butter and Parmesan cheese. I ate on the front porch with a glass of wine, watching the light fade across the water. The cabin was quiet in the careful way that lake cabins are quiet, with the small ambient sounds of water lapping against the pier and the occasional call of a barred owl in the woods behind the cabin. I felt, for the first time in many weeks, the small steady relief of being alone in a place where nobody could reach me. I went to bed at about 10:30. I locked the front door and the back door. I locked the back door specifically because it opened onto a small wooden deck that faced the lake and that I did not want left unlocked overnight. I slept well. I woke at about 7 in the morning. The cabin had a small electric coffee maker on the kitchen counter, and I had set it the night before to brew at 6:30. The coffee was already made. I poured a cup and walked out onto the front porch in my pajamas and my flannel jacket, the way I had been planning to start my mornings for the weekend. The lake was glass, still in the early light. The fall color on the surrounding ridges was reflected on the water with the small, careful precision that calm lakes produce on cool October mornings. I took a few sips of coffee. I walked down the small path from the porch to the pier, the way you walk down to a lake pier on a quiet morning, with the cup warm in your hand and the chill of the air still on your face. I noticed the footprints when I was about 3 steps onto the pier. I want to describe what I saw very precisely, because I have gone over the moment many times in the 5 years since. There was a single trail of small, wet, bare footprints leading from the edge of the water at the end of the pier, up the wooden planks of the pier, off the pier, and across the small flagstone path that led from the pier to the cabin's back deck, up the 3 wooden steps of the back deck, across the deck, and stopping at the back door of the cabin. The footprints were a child's. I want to be precise about that. They were small, maybe 4 inches long. The kind of footprints that a 6 or 7-year-old child makes when their bare, wet feet press onto a dry surface. I could see the small, clear toe prints, the small heel pads, the small arch of the instep. The footprints were spaced apart at the small, even pace of a child walking calmly, not running, not in any hurry. The wet had been wet enough, when the child had been on the pier, that the prints there were dark and clearly defined. By the time the child had reached the deck, about 30 feet from the water, the footprints had become slightly fainter, the kind of footprints that wet feet make when the wet has started to dry off. The footprints stopped at the back door. The last footprint was about 6 inches in front of the door, with the toes pointed toward the door. the way a person stands when they are facing a door. The footprints did not turn around. They did not go back to the water. They did not go around the cabin. They did not continue down the deck stairs. They simply stopped at the back door, with the toes pointed at the door, as if the child had walked up to the door and had not moved from that spot. I want to describe my state of mind in that first minute. I was 46 years old. I had spent the previous summer and fall going through the careful, slow process of deciding what kind of person I was going to be in the next phase of my life. I was a structural engineer. I had spent 20-some years working with measurable, predictable systems. I tried, in that first minute on the pier, to construct an explanation for what I was seeing. I considered, briefly, whether some other renter at one of the other cabins might have had a child who had wandered over to my cabin. I rejected this. The cabins were spaced far apart around the lake. The nearest other cabin was probably 600 yards away, on the far north shore. The lake was the only direct route between cabins. A child would have had to swim or paddle across the lake to reach my cabin from any other dock. The water was 60 degrees in mid-October. No child was swimming across that water at 6 in the morning. And in any case, the rental company had told me explicitly that I was the only renter that weekend. I considered whether some other person might have been on the property, a trespasser, somebody who had hiked in over the gate. I rejected this too. The footprints were too small to belong to any person who could have hiked in over the gate. The footprints were a child's, specifically a child's, and they came up out of the water, not down the gravel road from the gate. I walked up the pier slowly, following the trail of footprints. I did not step on them. I want to admit that. I walked beside them, the way a person walks beside a trail that they are not entirely sure they should be following. I followed the prints across the flagstone path, up the deck stairs, across the deck, to the back door. I stopped about 3 feet from the door. I looked at the last footprint. I looked at the door. The back door was the same back door I had locked the night before. I tried the handle. The handle did not turn. The door was still locked, from the inside, with the same deadbolt I had thrown the night before. The interior of the cabin was, by every measure I could apply, undisturbed. Through the small glass pane in the upper portion of the door, I could see the small back hallway of the cabin, the small mat I had set my boots on the night before, the small framed nature print on the opposite wall. Nothing inside the cabin had been moved. Nothing had been disturbed. The door had not been opened. I stood on the deck, and I looked at the footprints. I looked at the lake. I looked at the door. I tried to think. The morning sun was getting higher. I could see, even in the few minutes I had been standing on the deck, that the footprints were beginning to dry. The dark, wet outlines on the wood were fading into faint, damp shadows, then into nothing. By about 9 in the morning, when I had finally stopped staring at them, the footprints were gone. The wood of the deck and the pier looked exactly as it had looked when I had walked down on the previous afternoon. There was no record. There was no trace. There was no evidence that anything had been there. I want to say something about what I did next. I did not call the rental company. I did not call anybody. I went inside. I sat at the small kitchen table. I drank my coffee. I tried to convince myself, the way a person tries to convince himself of things he does not believe, that I had imagined what I had seen. I considered whether the wet patches on the pier might have been the result of some animal, a raccoon or a beaver, or a small deer that had come up out of the water. I considered the size and shape of the prints. I knew, with the quiet, steady certainty of a structural engineer, that no animal had made those footprints. They had been a child's bare feet. They had been clear and specific and unambiguous. I spent the rest of Saturday in the cabin. I did not go back outside. I did not paddle on the lake. I did not walk in the woods. I read a novel I had brought. I made myself a simple supper. I had 2 glasses of wine on the front porch in the early evening, watching the light fade across the water. I went to bed at about 10. I locked the front door and the back door, both of them, twice. I checked the locks. I went into the bedroom. I lay in bed, and I did not sleep until probably 1 in the morning. I woke at about 7 on Sunday. The coffee had brewed. I poured a cup. I want to admit that I considered, in those first few minutes after I woke up, whether I should leave the cabin without going down to the pier, whether I should pack my things and drive home, and not check whether the footprints were there again. The careful, sensible part of my mind The part that had been guiding me through the slow, careful process of the divorce and the slow, careful process of figuring out what kind of person I wanted to be in the next 10 years of my life, was telling me to pack the car and leave. A stronger part of me, perhaps the part that had been a structural engineer for 20-some years, and that needed to know what was going on in any system it found itself in, decided to walk down to the pier. I want to describe what I found. The footprints were there again. Same size, same path. The same single trail of small, wet, bare footprints, leading from the edge of the water at the end of the pier, up the wooden planks, across the flagstone path, up the deck stairs, across the deck, stopping at the back door, with the toes pointed at the door, in the same position they had stopped on the previous morning. The footprints did not turn around. They did not go back. They did not go anywhere. They simply stopped at the door. I stood on the deck and I looked at them. I tried to think. I considered, in the slow, careful way that I had been considering things for the previous 24 hours, whether the child was waiting for me to open the door, whether the small, bare, wet feet that had walked up out of the water and along the pier and across the deck had stopped at my back door because they had been hoping that I would notice them and would open the door. I considered, also, whether the child was not waiting for me to open the door but was simply there, in the small, private way that the child had been doing whatever the child had been doing, and that the door was as far as the child had intended to go, and that opening the door would be a response to a request that had not been made. I want to say something about what I did. I did not open the door. I did not stand on the deck and call out to the lake. I did not look at the water for any sign of the child. I walked back along the deck, around the side of the cabin, to the front porch. I went inside through the front door. I packed my bag. I packed the food I had not eaten. I locked the cabin. I walked to my car. I drove out the gravel road, through the gate, and back toward Roanoke. I called the rental company on Monday morning. I told them that the cabin had been fine and that I had decided to leave a day early because I had finished the personal work I had been hoping to do. I did not mention the footprints. The rental company woman on the phone was friendly and professional. She thanked me for staying with them. She asked, in a careful voice that I have thought about many times since, whether I would consider booking the cabin again in the future. I said I would think about it. I have not booked it again. In the 5 years since, I have remarried. My second husband is a kind, quiet man who does not need me to tell him every detail of my first marriage, and who has not pressed me on my reasons for being slightly afraid of small bodies of water at dawn. I have never told him about the footprints. I have not told my therapist. I have not told anyone. I have wondered, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, whether the child has been walking up out of the water and along that pier every morning for some long stretch of years, finding the back door of the cabin closed each time, finding the cabin's renter unwilling or unable to open it. I have wondered whether the child has been waiting for somebody to open the door, and what would have happened to me if I had. I have hoped, with everything in me, that the answer to the second question is something I do not need to know. I do not know whether to believe my own hope. The cabin sits on the south shore. The lake is glass still, in the early light. The footprints come up out of the water every morning. I hope nobody opens that door. I had been a fishing guide on a Blue Ridge Reservoir in northern Georgia for about 15 years by the summer of 2021, and I was 43 years old that August when the voice came up from under the dock. My day work, which had been my only work since I had quit a desk job at a regional bank in Gainesville in 2006, was running half-day and full-day guided fishing trips for clients who came up from Atlanta and Birmingham and the smaller towns around the lake. I ran a small wooden bass boat that I had bought, used, and rebuilt twice over the years. I knew the lake the way a man knows a thing he has spent a third of his life looking at. I knew where the base held in May and where they moved to in August. I knew which coves held water at the low pool of late summer and which ones went mostly to mud. I knew, as well as anyone alive in that part of North Georgia, the small particular world of that one reservoir. The lake itself was one of the smaller hydroelectric reservoirs in the Blue Ridge country of North Georgia, built by the Georgia Power Company in the late 1920s when they had dammed up a string of small mountain rivers to feed the growing demand for electricity in Atlanta. The reservoir had filled in slowly over the course of a few years in the early 1930s. A small handful of mountain communities had been displaced when the lake was filled, mostly small farms and a few crossroads villages along the original riverbeds. The houses had been moved or abandoned. The cemeteries had been relocated mostly. The original road network had been mostly bulldozed and submerged. By the time I was working the lake in the 2000s, the underwater landscape was a quiet, flooded country of old foundations and tree stumps, and the small, sunken shapes of buildings that nobody alive remembered. My family had owned a small lake house on a quiet stretch of the North Shore since 1971, when my grandfather had bought the property cheap from a farmer who was selling off shoreline parcels to pay off a tobacco debt. The house was a modest single-story frame building with a screened porch facing the water and a wooden dock extending about 30 feet out into a shallow cove. My grandfather had built the dock himself in the early 1970s, with treated lumber and heavy galvanized fasteners, and the dock had stood up to 50 years of weather and waves, with only the standard maintenance that a wooden dock requires. The planks were weathered gray. The wooden bench at the end of the dock, where my grandfather had liked to sit with a cup of coffee in the early mornings, was the same bench he had built in 1972. It had my grandfather's small initial carving in the underside, where he had marked it as his own work the day he had finished it. I had been using the lake house as my base for guided trips since 2006. My parents had inherited the property after my grandfather had passed in 2003. My mother had passed in 2009, and my father had moved to a retirement community in Florida shortly after, and the lake house had effectively become mine to manage. My sister Greta lived in Atlanta with her family and used the house for occasional weekends. I lived about 20 minutes inland from the lake in a small rented apartment in town, but I spent most of my working days at the lake house, which had become my de facto base of operations. I kept my bass boat at the dock. I kept my tackle in the small storage shed behind the house. I had supper on the screened porch most evenings before driving back to my apartment in town. I want to say something about my mother, because what happened on the dock that August evening cannot be told without talking about her. My mother had been a quiet, thoughtful woman from a small mountain family that had been in the North Georgia hills for at least 4 generations. She had passed in 2009 of an aggressive cancer that had taken her in less than 6 months from her diagnosis. I had been 31 years old when she had passed. I had been her younger of 2 children. My mother had called me by my full given name, including my middle name, my entire life. She had been the only person who had ever done so. My middle name was a family name from her grandfather's side, an old mountain name that had been passed down through her family for generations, and she had used the full 3-name version of my name when she had wanted my attention, the way mountain mothers sometimes use a child's full name to mark the seriousness of a moment. She had been the only person who knew the full name in casual use. My father had used a shortened version. My sister called me by a nickname. My friends knew me by a middle initial. The full 3-part version of my name had effectively died with my mother in 2009. The evening I am writing about was a Tuesday in mid-August. I had finished a half-day guide trip at about 1 in the afternoon, with 2 clients from Marietta who had wanted to fish for striper in the deeper sections of the lake. The trip had gone well. They had each landed a couple of decent fish. They had paid me cash and shaken my hand at the dock and driven back to Atlanta in their pickup truck. I had spent the rest of the afternoon at the lake house, doing the small maintenance work that a guide does on his off hours. I had cleaned the boat. I had reorganized my tackle. I had run a load of laundry on the small stackable washer-dryer in the back of the house. I had made myself supper at about 6:30. After supper, I took a beer down to the dock. The lake was glassy still. The cicadas were starting up in the woods behind the house. The light was the long, slow, honey-colored light that the southern Appalachians get on August evenings, when the humidity slows, the sun's descent, and the whole world seems to take on a warm, thick quality that you can almost feel against your skin. I sat down on my grandfather's bench at the end of the dock, the way I had sat there probably 1,000 times in my life. I propped my feet up on the small fishing rod holder that I had bolted to the dock years before. I drank my beer slowly. I watched a heron fish the shallows at the far end of the cove. The lake settled into its slow evening quiet. It was at about 7:15 that I heard the voice. I want to describe what I heard very precisely, because I have gone over the moment many thousands of times in the 4 years since. The voice came from underneath the wooden planks of the dock, not from the water beside the dock, not from somebody swimming under the dock. From inside the small enclosed space between the underside of the planks and the surface of the water, where the dock's support piling stood, and where there was, by my own measurement of my grandfather's construction, about 18 inches of vertical clearance between the bottom of the planks and the water level at the late summer low pool. The voice was a woman's voice. It was clear, calm, and unhurried. It was not a voice that was trying to get my attention from a distance. It was the voice of a person speaking at conversational volume from a position about 10 feet away from me in the small space directly under the dock. The voice was saying my name, my full given name, the three-part version that my mother had used. I sat on the bench and I did not move. I held the beer can in my hand. I did not turn my head. I did not look down. The voice said my name. There was a pause of about 2 seconds. The voice said my name again, in exactly the same calm, conversational tone, with exactly the same careful pronunciation. Another pause of about 2 seconds. The voice said my name a third time. Then the voice went quiet. The lake returned to its evening sounds. The cicadas, the small ripple of the heron working the shallows, the distant call of a barred owl in the woods behind the house. I want to describe what I understood in those few seconds. I understood that something was under the dock, something that knew my full name, including the middle name that my late mother had been the only person to use. Something that had spoken in a voice that was not my mother's voice, but that had used my mother's specific way of addressing me, the careful three-part calling that mountain mothers use to mark a serious moment with a child. I understood that whatever was under the dock had wanted my attention. I understood that the three calls were a complete signal, the kind of signal that a person sends when they want to be heard, and that the absence of any further calls meant that the signal had been fully delivered, and that whatever was under the dock was now waiting to see what I would do. I did not look under the dock. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I have thought about my decision in the 4 years since, and I do not know whether to be proud of it or ashamed of it. I do not know what I would have seen if I had looked. I do not know whether there would have been anything to see. I do not know whether the visible portion of the space under the dock at Low Pool would have shown me a woman crouched between the pilings, or a body floating face down in the dark water, or simply the same empty space that had been under the dock for 50 years. I made a small, careful decision in the moment of the third silence. I decided that I was not going to look. I was not going to lean over the side of the dock. I was not going to walk to the shore end of the dock and look back along the underside. I was not going to acknowledge, in any way, that I had heard the voice or that I knew where the voice had come from. I stood up. I held the beer can in my hand. I walked, at a steady, measured pace, the 30 feet from the bench at the end of the dock to the shore end. I did not run. I did not look down through the gaps between the planks. I walked the way a man walks when he wants to leave a place without communicating that he is leaving in fear. I reached the shore end of the dock. I stepped off the dock onto the small concrete pad my grandfather had poured at the base of the dock in 1972. I walked up the small gravel path to the back door of the lake house. I opened the door. I went inside. I closed the door. I locked it. I locked the front door. I locked the windows. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, and I tried to think. I sat in the kitchen for probably an hour. I did not turn on the lights. I did not call anyone. I did not check the dock through the windows. I sat with my back against the cabinet, and I thought about my mother, and I thought about the careful way she had said my full name when she had wanted my attention as a child, and I thought about the way her voice had sounded in the long final months of her illness, when she had been too tired to use the full version, and had started calling me by my first name only. I thought about the woman's voice under the dock and the way it had not been my mother's voice, but had been speaking my mother's name for me. I thought about all the things in the southern Appalachians that I had heard about over the years from my clients and from the older guides on the lake, the stories that older men told in the evenings at the boat ramp when they had been drinking, the stories my own grandfather had told me when I was a small child, and that I had mostly stopped believing as I had grown older. I thought about my grandfather sitting on the same bench at the end of the same dock for 30 years, and never, as far as I knew, mentioning anything that had happened to him on that dock that I could not explain. At about 8:30, I picked up my truck keys and my wallet from the kitchen counter. I let myself out the front door of the house. I locked the front door behind me. I walked the small driveway to my pickup truck. I got in, I locked the truck doors. I started the engine. I drove the small gravel road out to the main road, and I drove the 20 minutes back to my apartment in town. I slept in my truck that night, in the parking lot of my apartment building. Although I had a perfectly good apartment 30 feet away, I do not know exactly why I made that choice. I think I did not want to be inside walls that night, with rooms I would have to walk through in the dark and corners I would have to walk past. The truck cab was a small enclosed space that I knew the dimensions of. I locked the doors, I reclined the driver's seat. I slept fitfully until the morning came up. I have not been back to the lake house in the 4 years since. I have continued to work as a fishing guide. I run my trips out of the public boat ramp on the south end of the lake now, where I rent a small slip for my bass boat and where I keep my tackle in a small rented storage unit. I drive the 20 minutes from my apartment in town to the boat ramp every morning of the working season, and I drive the 20 minutes back in the evenings. I have continued to fish the same lake. I have not, in 4 years, run a guided trip in the cove where my family's house sits. When clients have asked me about the North Shore, I have told them that the base have moved to other parts of the lake. I have made up small, careful explanations. The clients have accepted them. My sister Greta has continued to use the house for her family weekends, mostly in the spring and the fall, mostly with her husband and her 2 teenage children. I have helped her arrange the small maintenance work that the house needs from time to time. A roof patch in 2022, a new water heater in 2023. I have hired the local contractors to do the work, and I have not been on the property myself when they have done it. Greta has not, in any conversation we have had over the 4 years, mentioned hearing anything strange at the lake house. She has not mentioned the dock. She has not mentioned a voice. She has not mentioned anything that would suggest she has had any experience like the one I had on that August evening. I have not asked her directly. I have decided, the way certain things get decided in a brother's life, that the question of whether my sister has heard anything she has chosen not to mention to me is not a question I want to answer. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that whoever or whatever was under the dock that evening was using my mother's name for me as a small, careful kindness, the way an older neighbor might use a familiar name to identify themselves to a child they have known a long time. I have hoped that the voice was not a request for me to look under the dock. I have hoped that the voice was not a summons. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that my mother is at peace, in some way I do not understand, and that whatever was under the dock was not pretending to be her, and that my mother's name for me was something that lingered in the air around the lake house, because she had used it there so often during her summers there as a young woman, and that some other thing had simply picked it up the way a thing picks up a habit. I do not know whether to believe my own hopes. I have not been back. I do not intend to. The dock is at the end of the small gravel path behind the house. The bench is at the end of the dock. My grandfather's initial is carved into the underside of the bench. The water moves slowly under the planks. I hope nobody else hears anything from underneath. I hope, if anyone does, that they have the sense, as I had, not to look. I had been a freelance graphic designer for about 12 years, by the spring of 2017, and I was 38 years old that April when an old college friend of mine asked me to house sit her lake house on a small private lake in southern West Virginia for 2 weeks, while she was on a research trip in Europe. My friend's name was Marlene. We had known each other since the early 2000s, when we had been roommates our junior year at a small liberal arts college in central Virginia. She had become a tenured professor of folklore at a regional university in Pennsylvania. I had stayed in graphic design and had ended up working from a small home office in Roanoke. We had stayed in close touch over the years, mostly through phone calls and the occasional weekend visit, and she had inherited the lake house from her grandmother in 2014 and had been spending most of her summers there since. The house was on a small private lake in the Blue Ridge country of southern West Virginia, in a rural county that I had never visited before, and Marlene had told me on the phone that she would be very grateful if I could spend the 2 weeks of her research trip at the house, mostly to make sure the pipes did not freeze in any late-season cold snap, and to feed the small population of barn cats that lived in her grandmother's old shed. I drove out to the lake house on a Sunday afternoon in mid-April. The drive from Roanoke took about 3 hours, mostly on small 2-lane state roads that wound up through the Blue Ridge country into the kind of remote rural terrain that southern West Virginia is full of. The house itself was at the end of a narrow gravel road about 6 miles up from the nearest paved highway, on a small parcel of land that Marlene's grandfather had bought in the late 1940s when the lake had first been formed. The lake was a small private impoundment that a regional hydroelectric company had built in 1947 by damming a small mountain creek. The lake was maybe a mile long and a quarter-mile across at its widest point. The shoreline was mostly forested. There were perhaps a dozen private cabins scattered along the east shore, where Marlene's house was. The west shore was undeveloped. The hydroelectric company had bought up the west shore land in the original construction and had never sold it, and the west shore had been a piece of forested mountain land for the entire 70 years of the lake's existence. The house was a modest, single-story frame building set about 30 feet back from the water, with a wooden dock extending about 20 feet out into a shallow cove. The dock was old and weathered but solid, the kind of dock that had been built carefully and maintained on a regular schedule. The kitchen had Marlene's grandmother's original 1950s appliances. The living room had a wood stove and a wall of old hardcover books and a comfortable old couch that Marlene had told me was the same couch she had read on every summer of her childhood. I let myself in with the key Marlene had mailed me. I unpacked. I went out to the shed and fed the 4 barn cats, who eyed me carefully and accepted the food without ceremony. I made myself supper. I went to bed early. I had brought work with me, the design files for a small marketing project that was due in 3 weeks, and I planned to spend most of my mornings at the kitchen table working and most of my afternoons walking the small trails that ran along the east shore of the lake. I want to describe what happened on my first morning, because the rowboat appeared on my first morning and on every morning that followed. I woke up that Monday at about 5 in the morning. I am, by long habit, an early riser. I had set my coffee maker the night before. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I carried it out to the screened porch that faced the lake. I sat down in one of the wicker chairs. The lake was completely still. The light was the gray pre-dawn light that the southern Appalachians get in mid-April, when the sun has not yet come up over the ridges but the sky has begun to lighten in the east. I watched the lake. I drank my coffee. I had been on the porch for about 15 minutes when I noticed the rowboat. I want to describe the rowboat very precisely, because I have gone over the image many thousands of times in the 8 years since. The rowboat was sitting motionless in the middle of the lake, about 300 yards from my dock. It was an old wooden rowboat of the kind that had been common on small Appalachian lakes from the 1920s through the 1960s, before aluminum and fiberglass had displaced wood as the standard material for small recreational craft. The boat was maybe 12 or 14 feet long, with the gentle upturned curve of a hand-built mountain rowboat. It was painted a faded dark green that had weathered to the gray-green color that old paint takes on after many years of exposure. The oars were shipped, lying inside the boat with their handles toward the bow. There was a single figure sitting on the middle thwart of the rowboat, facing my dock. The figure was, at 300 yards in pre-dawn light, hard to make out clearly. I could see the general shape of a seated person. The shoulders, the head, the arms resting on the knees. The figure appeared to be wearing dark clothing of some kind, perhaps an old dark coat with a hat or hood of some kind on the head. The figure was not moving. The boat was not moving. The water around the boat was not disturbed. The boat was simply sitting there, 300 yards from my dock, with a single seated figure facing my direction. I sat on the screened porch, and I watched the rowboat for about 10 minutes. The rowboat did not move. The figure did not move. The lake was glass still. The light slowly came up. At about 5:25, the figure raised its arms in a slow, careful motion and unshipped the oars. It set the oars in the locks. It began to row, slowly and steadily, toward the west shore. I want to describe the rowing. It was the rowing of a person who had spent a great many hours in a rowboat. The strokes were even. The pace was unhurried. The boat moved across the lake at the steady speed of a competent rower who was in no hurry to be anywhere. I watched the rowboat travel across the water for maybe 4 minutes, until it reached the far shore. The figure shipped the oars. The figure stepped out of the boat into the water. The figure pulled the boat up onto the shore. The figure walked up the slope into the trees. The boat was left sitting on the shore. I sat on the porch. I drank the rest of my coffee. I tried to think. I considered, in the first minute, whether the rowboat might belong to a neighbor. This was unlikely. The east shore had perhaps a dozen private cabins, And Marlene had told me that most of them were used only seasonally, and that none of them were occupied in mid-April. The West Shore had no cabins at all. I could see no smoke, no dock, no clearing on the West Shore where a person might be living. I considered whether the figure might be a fisherman. This was also unlikely. The figure had not been fishing. The figure had not had a fishing rod. The figure had simply been sitting in the boat, motionless, facing my dock, for maybe 25 minutes before rowing slowly to the West Shore and walking into the trees. I went back inside. I made breakfast. I worked at the kitchen table on my marketing project for the rest of the morning. By midday, I had largely put the rowboat out of my mind. The next morning, I woke up at 5 again. I made coffee. I went out to the screened porch. The rowboat appeared at 5:15. I want to be precise about this. I had not been timing it on the first morning, but the boat had appeared at roughly the same time. On the second morning, I checked my watch. The boat had not been visible at 5 to 10. At 5:15, when I looked up from my coffee, the boat was sitting in the middle of the lake. The figure was on the middle thwart. The position was the same. The orientation was the same. The boat sat for 10 minutes. The figure unshipped the oars at 5:25 and rowed slowly to the West Shore. The figure stepped out, pulled the boat up onto the shore, and walked into the trees. The whole sequence was identical to the first morning, in every detail I could observe. On the third morning, I brought binoculars to the porch. The binoculars were Marlene's grandfather's old field binoculars, which I had found on a shelf in the living room. They were good binoculars, with 8-power magnification and clean optics. I waited. The boat appeared at 5:15. I lifted the binoculars. I focused on the figure. I want to describe what I saw. The figure was wearing an old dark wool coat of the kind that men in the southern Appalachians had worn from approximately the 1920s through the 1950s. The coat had a high collar and large dark buttons. The figure was wearing dark trousers. The figure was wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat of the kind that older mountain men had worn, the kind of soft felt hat with a creased crown. The figure was facing my direction. I could see the shape of the head and the shoulders. I could not see the figure's face. I want to be precise about this. The binoculars were good. The light was not great, but it was not bad. At 300 yards, with 8-power magnification, I should have been able to make out the rough features of a face under the brim of the hat. There was no face. There was a dark shape under the brim of the hat where a face should have been. Not a blurred face. Not a face I could not quite make out. A dark shape, the same shade as the coat and the hat, where the face should have been. The shape was the shape of a head, but the surface of the head was the same dark gray-green as the rest of the figure, with no features visible, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, no skin tone of any kind. I lowered the binoculars. I sat on the porch. I watched the boat for the remaining 7 minutes of its stay. At 5:25, the figure unshipped the oars and rowed away. I watched the boat reach the West Shore. I watched the figure step out and pull the boat up. I watched the figure walk into the trees. I sat on the porch and I drank the rest of my coffee and I tried to think. On the fourth morning, the same thing happened. Same time, same boat, same figure, same 10 minutes of stillness, same slow row across to the West Shore. I did not bring the binoculars out that morning. I did not need to. I had seen what was in the boat, or rather, I had seen what was not in the boat, and I did not need to see it again. On the fifth morning, I made a decision. I waited until the boat had completed its sequence and the figure had walked into the trees on the West Shore. I drank the rest of my coffee. I went inside. I got into my car at about 6:30 and I drove around the lake. The drive took about 25 minutes. The long way around the lake, on the gravel road that connected the East Shore cabins to a small county road that ran along the south end of the lake and then up the west side of the property. The West Shore did not have any cabins, but a small dirt access road did run along the upper edge of the conservancy land, originally built by the hydroelectric company in the 1940s for maintenance access and never decommissioned. I parked my car at a small turnoff that I judged to be approximately opposite the spot where I had been watching the figure beach the boat each morning. I walked down the slope to the water. I want to describe what I found. The slope was a steep wooded hillside coming down to a narrow, muddy shoreline. The mud was the soft uniform mud that the bottom of a small mountain lake produces, undisturbed except for the small tracks of deer and raccoons. There was no rowboat. There were no tracks of any rowboat being pulled up onto the shore. There were no human footprints. There was no path leading up the slope into the trees. There was no clearing. There was no boathouse. There was no dock. There was nothing on the west shore that suggested any person had ever been on that piece of land in living memory. I stood at the water's edge, and I looked back across the lake. I could see Marlene's house clearly on the east shore, with its small wooden dock extending out into the cove. The dock looked, from the west shore, exactly the way the rowboat had looked from the dock, 300 yards across the still water of a small West Virginia lake. I drove back to the house. I worked the rest of that day at the kitchen table. The boat appeared again on each of the remaining mornings of my house sit. I did not go out to the porch on the last few mornings. I worked in the kitchen with my back to the lake. I let the cats out and fed them at midday and at evening. I did not go down to the dock. I did not look at the lake at 5:15. I do not know whether the boat appeared on those last mornings or not. I have decided I do not need to know. Marlene came back from her research trip on the second Sunday afternoon. I had cleaned the house. I had left the cats fed. I had packed my things. She came in the front door with her travel bags and her warm, familiar smile. She thanked me. She made us coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. She asked me in a casual voice how the mornings had been. I said, "Fine. Quiet." She looked at me for a long moment. She nodded slowly. She said, "I am glad." She did not ask me anything else about the mornings. She did not mention the boat. She did not mention the figure. She did not mention the West Shore. We talked about her research trip. We talked about the cats. We had supper together. I drove home that evening. We have remained close friends in the 8 years since. Marlene has continued to spend her summers at the lake house. She has invited me back several times. I have made polite excuses every time. She has accepted them without question. We have not, in any conversation in the 8 years since, mentioned the lake at 5:15 in the morning. I do not know whether she sees the boat. I have decided not to ask her. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the figure in the rowboat is making whatever crossing it is making for reasons that are entirely its own, and that the small private trip from the middle of the lake to the west shore is a thing it has been doing for a long time, and that nobody on either shore needs to do anything about it. I hope, if I am ever invited back to that house, that I have the sense to keep declining. I hope, most of all, that the boat continues to row away from the dock at 5:25 every morning, and that it does not, on some morning I cannot foresee, decide to row toward it instead. I had been working as a paralegal at a small firm in Lexington for about 4 years by the summer of 2022, and I was 28 years old that July when my college roommate Delia and I rented a small lake house on a private cove in eastern Kentucky for what was supposed to be a quiet 4-day weekend. Delia and I had been roommates. Our junior and senior years at a state university in central Kentucky had stayed close in the years since, and had developed the sort of comfortable friendship that you settle into with somebody who knew you before you became whoever you were going to become. She lived in Louisville now, working as a public school teacher. I lived in Lexington. We tried to take at least one weekend trip together every summer, usually somewhere in the Blue Ridge country of eastern Kentucky or western Virginia. And the cabin we had rented for July of 2022 was a small lake house on a private impoundment in a rural county that neither of us had visited before. The lake itself was a small private impoundment that had been built sometime in the 1950s by a regional development company that had bought up several thousand acres of mountain land and had created a small lake by damming a private M&O tributary of one of the larger Kentucky rivers. The lake was maybe 2 miles long and about a quarter mile across at its widest point, with a few dozen private cabins scattered along the shoreline. The development company had gone out of business in the 1980s, and the cabins had passed into private ownership over the decades, mostly to families from Lexington and Louisville who used them as summer retreats. Our cabin was on a small private cove on the southwest side of the lake, at the end of a narrow gravel road about 2 miles up from the nearest paved highway. The owner was a man named Garrett, who lived in Louisville and who managed the rental remotely through a small vacation rental website. We drove out from Lexington on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July. The drive took about 3 hours, mostly on small 2-lane state roads that wound up through the foothills into the kind of remote rural terrain that eastern Kentucky is full of. The cabin was a modest single-story log building with a wide back deck facing the cove and a small wooden boathouse at the edge of the water. Garrett had emailed me detailed instructions about the property, including the gate code for the private road, the location of the spare key, and the small list of house rules. He had mentioned in passing that the boathouse was not currently in use, that the small fishing boat that had been kept there for decades had been removed by his uncle the previous summer, and that we should not need to go inside the boathouse for anything during our stay. He had told us that the keys to the boathouse, if we wanted them for any reason, were on a small hook in the kitchen. I want to describe the boathouse, because the boathouse is what I am writing about. It was a small structure, maybe 12 feet by 16 feet, built of old cedar planks that had weathered to the silver-gray color that cedar takes on after 50 or 60 years of exposure to weather. The boathouse sat at the edge of the cove, with one side opening directly onto the water through a wide rolling door, and the other 3 sides solid cedar walls. The structure had a simple shed roof of corrugated metal that had also weathered to a dull, dark gray. The boathouse had been built, by Garrett's email account, sometime in the early 1960s, by his grandfather, and had been in continuous use as a fishing boat storage building until his uncle had cleared it out the previous summer. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. We unpacked. We made supper on the small grill on the back deck. We watched the light fade across the cove. The lake settled into its evening quiet. The cabin was lovely. The cove was peaceful. The view from the back deck was the kind of view that the Blue Ridge country puts in front of you to remind you why people stay in the mountains. Delia and I sat on the deck after supper with a bottle of wine, and we talked, the way old college roommates talk, about our work and about our lives, and about the small, ordinary things that had happened to each of us in the year since we had last seen each other. I had glanced at the boathouse maybe a dozen times over the course of that first evening. It sat directly downhill from the back deck, about 40 feet from where we were sitting, with a clear, unobstructed line of sight from our chairs to the side wall of the structure. The side wall I was looking at was the south wall, the one that faced the deck. The wall was a solid, unbroken expanse of cedar planks. I had noticed nothing unusual about it. I had not, in fact, paid much attention to it at all. It was simply a wall on the side of a small wooden building, the kind of wall that recedes into the background of a lake cove view. We went to bed at about 10:30. I slept well. I woke up at about 7 the next morning to the sound of birdsong and the small, comfortable awareness of being in a place I did not have to be anywhere else in. Delia and I made coffee on the back deck. We worked on a small jigsaw puzzle the cabin had in its living room. We took a long afternoon walk on a trail that ran along the shoreline. We came back to the cabin in the late afternoon and made supper again on the grill. We ate on the deck. The light slowly faded. The cicadas started up in the woods. The lake went still and dark. It was at about 9 in the evening of our second day that Delia, who had been sitting in the chair next to me on the deck, said, in a casual voice, "What is in the window?" I said, "What window?" She said, "The window on the side of the boathouse. There is a light on. I was not sure if maybe somebody was in there." I followed her line of sight. I looked at the south wall of the boathouse. There was a small square window in the cedar planks at about head height, maybe the size of a piece of notebook paper. The window was glazed with what looked like an old single-pane glass. Behind the glass was a thin, pale curtain of some kind, and behind the curtain was a small, steady, warm yellow light, the soft amber color of a kerosene lantern or an old incandescent bulb. The light was not bright. It was the small, steady glow of a lamp burning in a small enclosed space on the other side of a curtained window. The window was, by every visual measure available to me, the small, ordinary window of a small, ordinary outbuilding that somebody was inside of. I sat on the deck and I looked at the window for probably a full minute without speaking. I tried to think. I had been looking at that wall for almost 2 days. I had glanced at it a dozen times. I had not, on any of those previous glances, seen a window. I was certain of this in the way you are certain of small, ordinary visual facts that do not normally require examination. The wall had been an unbroken expanse of cedar planks. The wall now had a window in it, The window had a curtain. The window had a light on behind the curtain. I said, in a careful voice, "Delia, that window was not there an hour ago." She said, "What?" I said, "I have been looking at that wall all evening. It did not have a window. The wall was solid cedar planks." Delia looked at me for a moment. She looked at the boathouse. She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Maybe we should walk down and check. Maybe somebody is in there." I want to admit something, because the next decision is the one I have thought about most often in the 3 years since. I did not want to walk down to the boathouse. I did not want to check whether somebody was in there. I had a small, careful sense, the kind of sense that comes up sometimes in remote places at dusk, that walking down to that boathouse was not a thing I wanted to do. But Delia was already standing up. She was a practical woman. She was a public school teacher who had spent 10 years dealing with whatever was in front of her. She was the kind of person who, when she saw a light on in a building that the rental owner had told her was empty, was going to walk down and find out what was happening. We walked down the small grass slope from the back deck to the boathouse. I had brought a flashlight from the kitchen. The dusk was deepening around us. The cicadas were loud in the woods. We reached the boathouse. We walked along the south wall. There was no window. I want to be precise about this. The wall was a solid, unbroken expanse of cedar planks. The planks were old. They had the silver-gray weathering of cedar that has been in place for 60 years. The planks were tight against each other. There were no gaps. There was no window. There was no frame where a window had been. There was no patch of newer wood suggesting that a window had been removed and the opening filled in. The wall was, in every detail I could observe, a solid, uninterrupted expanse of original cedar siding that had been in place since the boathouse was built. I ran my hand along the planks at about head height, where the window had appeared to be from the deck. The wood was solid. The wood had the cool, slightly damp feel of cedar at dusk on a summer evening. There was no window. I stepped back. I looked at the wall. I looked at Delia. Delia was looking at the wall with the careful, blank expression of a person who was making an effort not to react visibly to something they did not understand. She walked the full length of the wall. She walked around the corner and checked the east wall, which faced the water. She walked back. She said, in a careful voice, "There is no window." I said, "I know." We walked around the entire boathouse. We checked all 4 walls. The north wall had a small, old-fashioned door, padlocked, that Garrett had mentioned in his email. The east wall had the rolling door that opened to the water. The south wall and the west wall had no openings of any kind. The wood on all 4 walls was original, weathered, solid, unbroken. There was no window on the south wall. There had never been a window on the south wall. There was no possibility, by any normal physical mechanism, that the wall I had been looking at from the deck 30 seconds ago had had a window in it. We walked back up to the deck. The walk took maybe 40 seconds. We sat back down in our chairs. We looked at the boathouse. The window was there. I want to describe this carefully. From the chairs on the back deck, in the deepening dusk, with our line of sight running across the small grass slope to the south wall of the boathouse, we could clearly see a small square window at about head height, glazed with what looked like old single-pane glass, behind which a thin, pale curtain hung, behind which a small, steady, warm yellow light was burning. The window was visible. The light was visible. The window was, from our position on the deck, the same small, ordinary window of a small, ordinary outbuilding that somebody was inside of, that we had walked down to investigate 45 seconds earlier and had found did not exist. Delia stood up. She did not say anything. She walked into the cabin. I followed her. She picked up her overnight bag from the bedroom. She started packing it. I watched her for a moment. Then I went into the second bedroom and I picked up my own bag and I started packing. We did not speak much. We packed quickly. We loaded the cars. We left a brief note for Garrett on the kitchen counter saying that we had had to leave early due to a family emergency and that we appreciated his hospitality. We locked the cabin. We put the key back in the lockbox. We drove out the gravel road in our 2 cars, with Delia following behind me. It was full dark by the time we reached the paved highway. We drove back to Lexington that night. The drive took about 3.5 hours. I do not remember most of it. I remember stopping for gas in a small town somewhere in the foothills. and Delia getting out of her car and walking over to mine and standing next to my window for a moment without saying anything, and then walking back to her car. I remember reaching the parking lot of my apartment building in Lexington at about 1:30 in the morning. I remember Delia pulling in behind me, getting out, hugging me briefly, saying she would call me the next day, and driving away toward Louisville. In the 3 years since, Delia and I have not talked about the boathouse. I want to say that as plainly as I can. We have remained close. We have continued to take occasional weekend trips together, although none of them have been to remote lake houses. We have spoken on the phone at least once a month. We have met for supper in Louisville or in Lexington several times a year. We have not, in any of those conversations, mentioned the cabin in eastern Kentucky. We have not mentioned the boathouse. We have not mentioned the window. We have not mentioned the small, steady, warm yellow light that we both saw burning behind a thin, pale curtain in a window that did not exist on a wall that we both touched with our own hands. We have made a small, quiet agreement, the kind of agreement that long friends make sometimes without ever putting it into words, that the events of that July weekend are not something we are going to speak about, and we have honored the agreement. Garrett, the cabin owner, never followed up about our early departure. He did not refund the unused portion of our stay. He did not ask us why we had left. He sent me a brief email about a week later thanking me for leaving the cabin clean and saying that he hoped the family emergency had been resolved. I told him it had. I have not rented from him again. I have not, in the years since, looked at his cabin's listing on the rental website. I do not know whether the cabin is still being rented out. I do not know whether other guests have noticed the window. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the small, steady, warm yellow light is something contained to that one boathouse on that one cove, and that whoever or whatever is on the other side of the window has been content to be looked at from the deck and not investigated, and that the small, careful agreement that nobody walks down to check the window twice is an agreement that other guests have figured out on their own. I have not gone back. I do not intend to. The boathouse is at the edge of the cove. The wall is solid cedar. There is no window in it. There is, sometimes, a small, steady, warm yellow light burning behind a thin, pale curtain, in a window that you can only see from a chair on the back deck, in a small enclosed space on the other side of an unbroken wall, where somebody is sitting with a lamp on and is, I hope, content to be left alone. I had been working as a regional sales manager for an industrial supply company in Birmingham for about 11 years by the spring of 2019, and I was 46 years old that May when I bought a small lake house on a Blue Ridge Lake in northern Alabama from an estate sale. I had been looking for a small weekend property for about 2 years by then. My wife had passed in 2015 of an aggressive autoimmune disease that had taken her in a little over a year, and my daughter had moved to Seattle for graduate school in 2017, and the small ranch house I had shared with my wife in a Birmingham suburb had grown too large and too quiet for me to rattle around in alone on the weekends. I had wanted, for some time, a small place in the mountains that I could drive to on Friday evenings and back from on Sunday afternoons, somewhere quiet, somewhere on water if I could find it, somewhere that was not the house my wife had decorated and the bedroom we had shared. The lake house I ended up buying was a small 2-bedroom frame cabin on a quiet stretch of shoreline on a small lake in the Blue Ridge foothills of northern Alabama, in a rural county about 3 hours from Birmingham. The lake was a small reservoir that had been built by the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1940s, the kind of small Blue Ridge lake that had a few dozen private cabins along its shoreline and a small public boat ramp at one end, and not much else. The cabin was modest, a single-story frame building with a small kitchen, a living room with a wood stove, 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, and a screened porch facing the water. The property included a small wooden dock, extending about 20 feet out into a quiet cove. The cabin sat on a half-acre lot with a few large old hickory trees and a small grass yard between the porch and the dock. The cabin had come up at an estate sale because the previous owners, an older couple named Hollis and Mavis Pickett, had both passed within a year of each other. Hollis had passed in late 2017 of a stroke. Mavis had passed in late 2018 of pneumonia, alone in their small house in a town about 15 miles from the lake. They had been in their early 80s at the time of their deaths. They had owned the lake cabin for 51 years. They had bought it new from the regional development company that had built the cabin in 1968. The realtor handling the estate sale, a careful woman in her 50s named Loretta, had told me on the phone that the cabin had no living heirs, that the couple had passed without any direct descendants, and that the entire estate was being liquidated by a court-appointed administrator who was working through the small list of remaining personal effects and the modest value of the real estate. I closed on the property in mid-May. The closing was straightforward. The cabin was sold furnished, with most of the Pickett's personal furniture and household items still in place, the kind of full furnishing sale that sometimes happens with estate properties when there are no heirs to claim the contents and no commercial reason for the administrator to organize a separate household sale. I drove up to the cabin the following Saturday with a small load of my own belongings to start the process of moving in. I had told myself I was going to do a careful inventory of the existing furnishings, decide what to keep and what to donate, and gradually make the cabin my own over the course of the summer. I want to say something about the Pickett's personal effects, because the photograph I found was one of them. The cabin had the lived-in quality of a property that had been used regularly for 50 years. The kitchen had cast-iron skillets that had been seasoned for decades. The living room had a bookshelf full of paperback novels with cracked spines and the dates of various decades penciled into the inside covers. The screened porch had 2 wicker chairs with cushions that had been recovered at least 3 times by hand. The bedrooms had quilts that looked like they had been made by Mavis herself, with the small, careful stitching of a woman who had spent a long winter on each one. The cabin felt like the cabin of a couple who had loved the property and who had used it as a small, steady refuge from their workaday lives in town. I started with the kitchen. I wanted to clean the cabinets and the drawers before I unpacked any of my own kitchen things. I emptied the cabinets. I went through the drawers. The drawers held the standard contents of a long-used kitchen: old utensils, a drawer of dish towels, a small drawer of miscellaneous keys and screwdrivers, and the kind of small household items that accumulate over decades. In the bottom drawer next to the refrigerator, the kind of drawer that often becomes a junk drawer in a long-used kitchen, I found a small framed photograph face down on top of a stack of old grocery receipts. I picked the photograph up. I turned it over. The photograph was a posed family portrait taken on the dock of the cabin. The frame was a simple black wooden frame, maybe 5 inches by 7 inches, the kind of frame that you would buy at any drugstore or department store. The photograph itself was clearly recent, taken with a digital camera on a sunny summer day. The colors were saturated and crisp. There were 5 people in the photograph, posed in 2 rows on the small wooden dock at the back of the cabin. The dock visible in the background of the photograph was, by every detail I could observe, the same dock I had walked out on that morning. The same wooden planks, the same small bench at the end, the same cove behind it. The 5 people were arranged in a posed family photograph of the kind that people sometimes take on summer vacations. The back row had 2 adults. The husband was a tall, lean man in his late 70s, with white hair and a friendly mountain face, wearing a short-sleeved button-down shirt and khaki shorts. The wife was a small, sturdy woman in her late 70s, with white hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a faded blue sundress. I recognized the husband and the wife. I had seen them in the photograph the realtor had emailed me from the estate file. They were Hollis and Mavis Pickett, the previous owners of the cabin. The front row had 3 children. They were arranged kneeling on the dock in front of the standing adults. A boy of maybe 10, in a blue t-shirt and shorts. A girl of maybe 7, in a pink sundress with her hair in 2 small pigtails. A boy of maybe 4, in a small striped shirt and a pair of swimming trunks. The 3 children were smiling at the camera. They had the easy, comfortable posture of children who had been on that dock many times in their lives. The 2 boys had the same dark brown hair as Hollis. The girl had the small, careful smile that Mavis had had in the photograph the realtor had sent. I sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in my hand. I tried to think. The realtor had told me, twice, that the Picketts had no living heirs. The estate had been administered through the probate court because the couple had no children, no grandchildren, no nieces or nephews who could be located. I had assumed, in the casual way that buyers assume things about properties they have just bought, that the realtor had been telling me the truth, and that the photograph in front of me was therefore a photograph of some other family who had visited the cabin at some point. Perhaps the children were the children of a family friend. Perhaps the children had been guests on a single summer afternoon, and Hollis and Mavis had asked them to pose for a photograph as a small kindness. I called the realtor that evening. Loretta picked up on the third ring. I told her I had a question about the Picketts. I asked her, in a careful voice, whether she had any information about a family that might have visited the Picketts at the cabin, perhaps a family with 3 children who might have been close enough to the couple to appear in a posed photograph on the dock. Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, I knew Hollis and Mavis personally. They were friends of my late husband's family. They never had children. They never had any nieces or nephews close enough to spend summers with them. I asked around very carefully when I was working the estate, because I wanted to make sure we were not missing any surviving relatives. The Picketts had no children of their own, and Mavis's only sister had passed in the 1990s without children, and Hollis was an only child whose parents had passed in the 1980s. There was nobody. Why do you ask?" I told her I had found a family photograph in a kitchen drawer. I described it, the dock, the 5 people, Hollis and Mavis in the back row, 3 children in the front row. I told her the photograph was clearly recent, taken with a digital camera, with the saturated colors of a sunny summer day in the past few years. I told her I was holding the photograph in my hand at that moment. Loretta was quiet for a much longer time. Then she said in a careful voice, "Honey, can you take a picture of that photograph and email it to me?" I did. I took a careful photograph with my phone of the framed portrait sitting on the kitchen counter under the overhead light, and I emailed it to Loretta. I waited. About 15 minutes later, my phone rang. Loretta said, "Honey, I have looked at the photograph. I do not know who the children are. I do not know who took the photograph. I am going to ask you a small favor. I am going to ask you to put the photograph back in the drawer where you found it. I am not going to charge you anything for this advice. I am going to tell you, as a personal favor from a woman who has been selling estate properties in this county for 30 years, that I have seen unusual photographs come up in estates before, and that the simplest thing you can do when a photograph like this turns up is to leave it where it is. Will you do that?" I said, "Loretta, what do you mean, unusual photographs?" She said, "I mean photographs that did not exist before the property changed hands, and that the new owners find when they are going through the contents. It happens sometimes, not often, maybe once every 5 or 6 years. The estate properties that produce these photographs are usually owned by older couples who passed without heirs. The photographs usually appear in places that the new owners would notice them. They usually have the new owner's family in them, or they have unfamiliar children, or they have somebody the new owner cannot identify. I do not have a complete theory of what the photographs are. I have a small private practice, when I encounter one in an estate I am working, of advising the new owner to leave the photograph in place. I have not had any new owner who has done this report any further trouble with the property. I have had 2 new owners over the years who decided to remove or destroy a photograph they had found, and both of those new owners ended up selling their property within the year and not staying in the area. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what I would do if I were you." I said, "All right." I put the photograph back in the kitchen drawer. I closed the drawer. I made myself supper. I tried not to think about it. I went to bed early. In the 6 years since, I have kept the cabin. I have spent most of my weekends there. I have, for the most part, made it my own. I have replaced the wicker chairs on the porch. I have repainted the kitchen. I have donated most of the Pickett's books and most of their kitchen utensils. I have not, however, removed the photograph from the kitchen drawer. The photograph is in the bottom drawer next to the refrigerator, exactly where I found it on my first morning at the cabin, in the same black wooden frame, face down, on top of a stack of old grocery receipts that I have also left in place. Every few months, in the casual way that you sometimes open a drawer you do not use very often, I have opened the drawer and looked at the photograph. I have not been able to bring myself to look at it on a regular schedule. I have not made it a deliberate practice. I have simply, every now and then, opened the drawer, picked up the framed photograph, turned it over, and looked at it. The children are getting older. I want to be precise about this. The boy in the blue t-shirt who appeared to be about 10 in the photograph the day I bought the cabin, has slowly grown up over the past 6 years. He is now a tall, lean teenager, maybe 16, with the lanky build of a boy in the late stages of adolescence. The girl in the pink sundress has also grown. She is now a girl of about 13, with longer hair and the small, careful seriousness of a girl on the edge of becoming a young woman. The smaller boy in the striped shirt has grown the most. He is now maybe 10, with the gap-toothed smile of a kid in the middle of his elementary years. The dock behind them is the same dock. The cove is the same cove. Hollis and Mavis are still in the back row, although they are also older. They look now to be in their late 80s or early 90s. Mavis's hair has gone whiter. Hollis has lost some weight. They are still smiling. They are still standing on my dock. I have not removed the photograph. I have not destroyed it. I have not shown it to my daughter, who has visited me at the cabin 3 times in the past 6 years, and who has not opened the kitchen drawer. I have not shown it to the woman I have been seeing for the past 2 years, a kind widow who lives in Birmingham, and who comes up with me to the cabin most weekends, and who has not opened the kitchen drawer either. I have not called Loretta, although Loretta is still a realtor in the area and is still selling properties on the lake. I have honored her advice. I have left the photograph in place. I have allowed the family in the photograph to age along with me. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the family in the photograph is being honored, in some way I do not understand, by my decision to leave it where it is. I have hoped that the children are being allowed to grow up, the way the children of Hollis and Mavis Pickett would have grown up if Hollis and Mavis had ever had children. I have hoped that the cabin is, in some small, careful way, the cabin those children would have summered at. I have hoped that my decision to leave the photograph in the drawer is the small kindness that allows the children to keep aging. I do not know whether to believe any of those hopes. I have decided not to investigate them further. The photograph is in the drawer. The children are getting older. The dock is at the back of the cabin. I will not move the photograph. I will not, when I am old, leave the cabin to my daughter or to anyone else who might find the photograph and decide to throw it away. I have made arrangements with my attorney for the cabin to be sold at my passing through a careful estate sale, with the household contents intact, and for the framed photograph in the kitchen drawer to be specifically left in place. I have not told the attorney why. He has not asked. I had been working as a registered nurse at a regional hospital in Knoxville for about 9 years by the summer of 2015, and I was 31 years old that July, when I drove out to my parents' lake house on a small lake in Middle Tennessee for what was supposed to be a quiet, long weekend at the end of a difficult stretch of shifts. My parents had owned the lake house since the late 1980s, when they had bought the small frame cabin from the original family that had built it in the 1950s. The lake itself was a small reservoir in the Blue Ridge foothills of Middle Tennessee, one of the smaller TVA-built lakes in that part of the state, the kind of small mountain lake that had a few dozen private cabins along its shoreline and a small public beach at the south end and not much else. My parents had used the cabin every summer of my childhood. I had grown up swimming in the cove off our dock. I had grown up paddling our small canoe across the still water in the early mornings. The lake was, in the way that summer places sometimes become for people who grew up at them, the place I went back to when I needed to remember what it felt like to be a child in a quiet place. My parents were not at the cabin that weekend. They had moved permanently to a retirement community in eastern Tennessee in 2013, after my father's heart attack, and they used the cabin only occasionally now. They had given me the keys and told me, as they always told me, to use the place whenever I wanted. I had driven out from Knoxville on a Friday afternoon, alone, with a small suitcase and a cooler of groceries and a stack of paperback novels I had been meaning to read for the past year. I had told my husband, who was a paramedic and who was working a long stretch of weekend shifts, that I would be back on Sunday evening. I had unlocked the cabin in the late afternoon. I had unpacked. I had sat on the screen porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the light slowly change across the cove. I want to describe the cove, because the cove is what I am writing about. It was a small inlet on the east side of the lake, maybe 400 yards across at its widest point, with our dock on the north side and a quiet stretch of forested shoreline on the south side. The cove opened into the main body of the lake at its west end, where a small point of land curved out and formed the natural boundary of the inlet. The public beach was on the south shore of the cove, about 300 yards across the water from our dock. The beach was a small county-maintained recreation area with a roped swimming zone, a few picnic tables, and a small parking lot. The beach was the kind of small rural Tennessee swimming beach that families in the area used on summer afternoons, and that was usually empty by the time the sun went down. I went down to the dock after supper that Friday evening. The light was the long, slow, honey-colored light of a southern Appalachian summer evening, when the humidity slows the sun's descent and the whole cove seems to glow for an hour or more, before full dusk settles in. I sat down on the small wooden bench at the end of the dock, the way I had sat there countless times in my life. I watched the heron that worked the shallows on the south shore. I watched the small ripples that the late evening breeze made on the surface of the water. I watched, after a while, the small dark shape that was moving slowly through the water about 150 yards from my dock. The shape was a person swimming. I want to describe what I saw very precisely, because I have gone over the image many thousands of times in the 10 years since. The person was swimming in a steady, deliberate breaststroke, the kind of stroke that an experienced swimmer uses for distance, with the head coming up briefly between strokes and going back down with each pull of the arms. The person's head was a small, dark shape on the water. The shoulders were visible just below the surface. The swimmer was moving in a straight line from somewhere near the middle of the cove, toward the public beach on the south shore. The swimmer was, by the angle of approach and the distance she had to cover, going to reach the beach in maybe 10 or 15 minutes at her current pace. I sat on the bench, and I watched her. I felt no particular alarm. I had grown up on the lake. I had seen people swim across the cove many times in my life. The cove was a popular evening swim for adults from the cabins on the north shore, who liked to swim across to the public beach and back as a small evening exercise routine. I assumed, in the casual way that you assume things about familiar scenes and familiar places, that the woman in the water was a neighbor I did not recognize, taking her evening swim. I drank my iced tea. I watched the heron. I watched the swimmer. After about 10 minutes, I noticed that the swimmer did not seem to be getting any closer to shore. I want to be precise about this. I had been watching her swim in a steady, deliberate breaststroke for 10 minutes. She had been making the unhurried but persistent forward progress that an experienced swimmer makes when they are committed to a long stroke. She should have, by my estimate of her pace, covered about 40 or 50 yards in those 10 minutes. She had not. She was still in approximately the same position in the cove, about 150 yards from my dock, about 150 yards from the public beach on the south shore, in the middle of the cove between the two shorelines. I sat on the bench. I tried to think. I considered, in the first minute, whether I might have been mistaken about her starting position. I had not been timing her precisely. I had been watching the heron and drinking my tea, and only intermittently looking at the swimmer. Maybe she had started further out from the beach than I had thought, and her 10 minutes of stroking had moved her exactly the distance that 10 minutes of stroking should have moved her, and I was simply confused about the geometry of the cove. I considered this. I rejected it. I had grown up on this cove. I knew its dimensions. I knew where the public beach was. I knew where the middle of the cove was. The swimmer was in the middle of the cove. She had been there 10 minutes ago. She was there now. I watched her for another 5 minutes. The light was beginning to fade. The heron flew off across the water. The cicadas started up in the woods behind the cabin. The swimmer continued her steady breaststroke. She did not change her pace. She did not change her direction. She did not change her distance from either shore. She was, by every measure I could apply, from 150 yards away on a small wooden dock at dusk, swimming in place. I stood up. I walked back up to the cabin. I did not run. I did not feel afraid yet. I felt the small, careful curiosity of a person who had noticed an inconsistency in a familiar scene and wanted to confirm what she was seeing. My father had kept a pair of old field binoculars on a shelf in the living room for as long as I could remember, the kind of heavy handheld binoculars that he had used for watching the ospreys that occasionally hunted the cove in the spring. I picked up the binoculars. I walked back down to the dock. I sat on the bench. I lifted the binoculars to my eyes. I focused on the swimmer. I want to describe what I saw through the binoculars. The swimmer was a woman. She was middle-aged, maybe late 30s or early 40s. She had dark hair that was cut to about chin length, the kind of practical haircut that a woman who spent time on lakes might have. She was wearing what looked like a dark-colored bathing suit of an older style, the kind of one-piece bathing suit that women had worn from the 1940s through the early 1960s, with the small modesty skirt at the hips. Her face was visible when her head came up between strokes. Her expression was the calm, focused expression of a swimmer who was not in distress. She was not gasping. She was not flailing. She was not looking around for help. She was swimming the way a swimmer swims when she is on a routine training swim that she has done many times before. I lowered the binoculars. I sat on the bench. I tried to think. I lifted the binoculars again. I watched her for another 5 minutes. She did not change. She continued the steady breaststroke. Her position in the cove did not change. She was swimming, by every visual measure I could make through good optics, at 150 yards, with the determined effort of an experienced swimmer who was going somewhere, but she was not getting anywhere. The shore on the south side did not get closer. The shore on the north side did not get farther away. She was suspended somehow in the middle of the cove, executing a long-distance swimming motion in place. The light continued to fade. The dusk deepened into the long, slow blue light that the southern Appalachians get on summer evenings before full dark. The swimmer continued. I sat on the bench with the binoculars in my lap. I watched her with my unaided eyes for a while, and then again with the binoculars, and then again with my unaided eyes. The pattern did not change. She did not stop. She did not slow. She did not change direction. She did not reach either shore. It became full dark at about 9:30. The swimmer was still in the cove. I could see, in the moonlight that came up about half an hour later, the small, dark shape of her head on the surface of the water, still moving in the steady, rhythmic pattern of a breaststroke, still in the middle of the cove, still suspended halfway between two shores that she was never going to reach. I went up to the cabin at about 10. I locked the porch door. I locked the front door. I locked the windows in the bedroom that faced the lake. I did not look out the window again. I lay in bed for a long time. I tried to think about what I had seen. I tried to construct an explanation. I did not sleep well. The next morning, I drove out to the small general store at the south end of the lake, where I had stopped occasionally over the years to buy ice or bread or the small things you sometimes need at a lake house. The store was run by an old man named Renfro, who I had known since I was a child. Renfro was in his late 70s that summer, a careful, courtly mountain man who had grown up on the lake and who had been running the general store since the 1970s. He was one of the few people in that part of the county who could be relied upon to remember anything that had happened at the lake before the 1990s. I walked into the store at about 9 in the morning. Renfro was behind the counter, drinking a cup of coffee. He nodded at me. He asked after my parents. We talked for a few minutes about the small, ordinary things that you talk about with a man who has known your family for 30 years. I bought a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk. I paid for them at the counter. As Renfro was making my change, I asked him, in as casual a voice as I could manage, whether he could tell me whether anyone had ever drowned in the cove off our cabin. Renfro did not answer immediately. He put my change down on the counter. He looked at me for a long moment. His face went still in the particular way that older faces sometimes go still when they hear a question they have heard before and have hoped not to hear again. He said, in a careful voice, "Yes, ma'am. There was a woman who drowned in your cove. Her name was Margaret. She drowned in 1962. I said, "Renfro." He said, "I am going to ask you a question, ma'am. I am going to ask you, and I would like you to answer me honestly. Did you see her last night?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Was she swimming toward the south beach?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry, ma'am. I had assumed, in all the years your family has had the cabin, that somebody must have told you about Margaret. Most of the families on this cove know. Most of us stopped looking at the water after dusk a long time ago. I should have made sure you knew. I should have told you when you were a girl. I had assumed your father had told you. I am sorry." I said, "Renfro, who was she?" He said, "She was a woman who lived in one of the cabins on the North Shore. The cabin 3 doors down from your parents' place, the one that the Hadley family owns now. In 1962, the cabin was owned by a man named Reed. and Margaret was his wife. She was a strong swimmer. She used to swim across the cove to the public beach in the evenings, after her supper, and walk back along the shore road. It was her routine. She did it most nights of the summer. On the night of August the 11th, in 1962, she went out for her swim and she did not come back. They found her body 2 days later, washed up against a small rocky point on the south shore. The county sheriff ruled it a drowning. There was some discussion at the time about whether she might have had a heart attack while she was swimming. There was some discussion about whether she might have gotten caught in some kind of submerged hazard. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. She was 38 years old. She left a husband and 2 small children. Her husband sold the cabin in 1965 and moved away. The children grew up and moved away. Nobody who lives on this lake now remembers her family personally. Some of us remember the night. I said, "Renfro." He said, "She has been swimming in the cove every summer since 1962, ma'am. Most of us see her once or twice a season, around dusk. Most of us, after we see her the first time, stop looking at the water after the sun goes down. I had assumed somebody had told you. I am sorry, ma'am." I drove back to the cabin. I packed my things. I drove home to Knoxville that afternoon. I have not been back to the lake house in the 10 years since. My parents have continued to use the cabin occasionally, in the careful way that older people use places that they cannot quite bring themselves to sell. They have not mentioned Margaret to me. I have not asked them whether they know. My husband and I have been invited to the cabin several times by my parents. We have made polite excuses every time. The excuses have been accepted without question. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that Margaret is at peace, in some way I do not understand, and that the steady, deliberate breaststroke she swims across the cove every summer evening is a thing she is doing for reasons that are entirely her own, and that she will eventually reach the south shore, and that the swim will end. I do not know whether to believe my own hope. The cove is at the back of my parents' cabin. The water is still. The dock is at the end of the small grass yard. I hope Margaret reaches the beach, eventually. I hope, when she does, that somebody is there to walk her home. I had been married to my husband Wesley for about 3 years by the fall of 2020, and I was 36 years old that October when I drove out alone to his family's lake house on a small lake in southwestern Virginia for what was supposed to be a quiet, long weekend of grading papers. I was working then as a high school English teacher at a private school in Roanoke, and the fall semester had been the kind of long, difficult semester that the first year of remote teaching during the pandemic had turned almost every semester into for the first half of that year. I had a stack of about 140 essays to grade, and Wesley had suggested, in the kind way that he sometimes suggested things, that I take the cabin for myself for the weekend and spread the essays across the dining table and grade in peace. He would stay in Roanoke with our dog. He would meet me back at the cabin on the following weekend if I needed 2 weekends to finish. The lake house was on a small private lake in a rural county of southwestern Virginia in the Blue Ridge country about 2 hours from Roanoke. The lake was a small impoundment that a regional development company had built in the 1950s by damming a small mountain creek, and the cabins along the shoreline were mostly modest summer places that the original buyers had passed down to their children. Wesley's grandparents had bought the cabin in 1962, when his mother was a teenager. The cabin had been in the family for 58 years, by the fall of 2020. It had passed from his grandparents to his mother in the late 1990s, and his mother, who was in her 70s and who lived in Charlottesville, used the cabin occasionally now, but had largely turned it over to Wesley and me, to use whenever we wanted. We had spent maybe a dozen weekends there over the 3 years of our marriage. I was familiar with the property. I had been comfortable, in the past, staying there overnight by myself. I drove out from Roanoke on a Friday afternoon in mid-October. The drive took about 2 hours, mostly on small 2-lane state roads that wound up through the Blue Ridge country into the kind of remote rural terrain that southwestern Virginia is full of. The fall color was at its peak in that part of the state, the maples and the sugar maples and the sourwood trees turning in the slow, steady way they turn in the southern Appalachians. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. I unlocked the front door with my key. I unloaded my essays and my groceries and my small overnight bag. I made myself supper. I worked at the dining table on the first 10 essays of the stack until about 10, when the long week of teaching caught up with me and I decided to go to bed. I want to describe the cabin's layout, because the layout matters to what I am writing about. The cabin was a two-story frame building set about 30 feet back from the water, with a wide back deck on the lower level facing the lake. The first floor had the kitchen, the dining room, and the living room. The second floor had 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. The bedroom Wesley and I usually used when we stayed at the cabin was the larger of the 2 upstairs bedrooms, which had been Wesley's mother's bedroom when she was a girl and which had a large picture window facing the water. The window was on the lakeside wall of the room. It was about 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. It looked out over the back deck below and the small grass yard beyond and the cove of the lake at the bottom of the yard. The window was on the second floor of the cabin, which meant that the bottom of the window was about 15 feet above the back deck and about 20 feet above the surface of the lake. The lakeside wall of the cabin was a flat siding of cedar planks. There was no balcony. There was no overhang. There was no tree branch that reached the window. The wall below the window was a 15-foot drop to the wooden planks of the deck. I went up to the bedroom at about 10:30. I changed into my pajamas. I got into bed. I left the curtains open, the way I usually did, because I liked to see the moonlight on the water in the early morning. I read for a while. I turned off the bedside lamp at about 11. I fell asleep. I woke up at midnight to the sound of a knock on the window. I want to describe what I heard very precisely, because I have gone over the moment many times in the 5 years since. The knock was a soft, polite knock. It was the sound of 3 light taps on the glass of the window, in a careful, even rhythm, the kind of knock that a guest makes on a door at a house where they have been invited but where they do not want to disturb anyone. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. The pauses between the taps were each maybe half a second long. The 3 taps together took about 2 seconds. I lay in bed, and I did not move. The bedroom was completely dark. The curtains were open. The window was about 8 feet from the bed. Through the window I could see, faintly, the dark outline of the trees on the far side of the cove, lit by the small moonlight that was filtering through the partial cloud cover. The window was visible to me as a slightly less dark rectangle in the dark wall of the room. I could see no shape on the glass. I could see no figure. I could see only the window, with a dim view of the lake beyond it, exactly as it had been when I had gone to sleep. I tried to think. I considered, in the first second, that I might have dreamed the knock. Sleeping minds sometimes produce small auditory hallucinations in the moments between sleep and waking, the kind of half-dream sounds that can be very convincing in the moment. I considered this. I rejected it. The knock had been clear. It had been deliberate. It had been a sequence of 3 discrete taps in a careful rhythm. I considered whether the knock might have come from somewhere else in the cabin and had only sounded like it had come from the window. I considered this too. I rejected it. I had grown up in old houses. I knew the small ambient sounds that old wooden buildings make at night, the settling, the contraction of cooling timbers, the small clicks of pipes, and the ticks of the wood stove cooling down. The sound I had heard had not been any of those sounds. It had been a knock on glass. The knock had come from the window directly across from the foot of my bed. I lay in bed. I did not move. I stared at the ceiling. I tried to breathe quietly. The cabin was completely silent. I could hear nothing on the other side of the window. No movement, no breathing, no further sound. The minutes passed. I started to think, in the small, careful way that you sometimes think yourself into believing a thing you want to believe, that I had been mistaken, that the knock had been some small sound I had misidentified, that I should turn over and go back to sleep. Exactly 1 minute after the first knock, the second knock came. It was the same knock. 3 soft, polite taps on the glass, in the same careful, even rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. The volume was the same. The rhythm was the same. The location was the same. The taps were coming from the window. I want to describe what I understood at this point. The first knock had been ambiguous. The first knock could have been my imagination, or some small sound I had misidentified, or one of the small unexplainable noises that old houses sometimes produce. The second knock could not be any of those things. The second knock had come exactly 1 minute after the first. The first and the second knock were the same in every detail I could observe. The pattern was deliberate. The pattern was the pattern of a person who was waiting at a window for a response, and who, after receiving no response on the first attempt, was going to make a second attempt, and who would, presumably, after another minute of silence, make a third attempt. I did not look at the window. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I made a small, careful decision in the silence after the second knock. I decided that I was not going to turn my head toward the window. I was not going to sit up. I was not going to look. I was not going to acknowledge, in any way, the presence of whoever or whatever was on the other side of the glass. The bedroom was dark. The window was 20 feet above the surface of the lake. There was no balcony. There was no tree branch. There was no possibility, by any normal physical mechanism, that somebody was standing at that window knocking on the glass. Whatever was knocking was not a thing I wanted to look at. The third knock came at exactly 1 o'clock. Same 3 soft, polite taps. Same rhythm, same volume, same location. The third knock was the last knock. After the third sequence of taps, the cabin was completely silent. I lay in bed and I waited. The minutes passed. I expected, with a kind of slow dread, that a fourth knock would come at 1:05. The minute came. The fourth knock did not. I lay in bed and I waited. I expected a knock at 10 past. There was no knock. I expected a knock at the 1/4 past. There was no knock. I lay in bed for the rest of the night. I did not turn over. I did not look at the window. I did not get up to use the bathroom. I lay on my back with my eyes on the ceiling, and I waited for the slow gray light of dawn to come up over the lake. The dawn came up at about 6:45. The bedroom slowly filled with the pale early morning light. I could see, then, the window in the wall across from the bed. I looked at it carefully. I could see the glass. I could see, through the glass, the small grass yard and the dock and the cove beyond. I could see no shape on the glass. I could see no figure on the deck below the window. I could see no movement of any kind. I got out of bed. I walked to the window. I looked at the glass. I want to describe what I saw very precisely. The glass was clean. The glass had the small layer of fine pollen and dust that an outside-facing window in a Blue Ridge cabin develops over the course of a season. The dust was undisturbed. There were no marks on the glass. There were no prints. There was no smudge of any kind. There was no water. There was no condensation pattern. There was nothing on the surface of the glass that suggested that anything had touched it from the outside, the night before, or at any other recent time. The window was, by every visual measure I could make in the morning light, a window that had not been touched. I went downstairs. I made coffee. I sat at the dining table with my coffee and my stack of essays. I tried to grade. I could not concentrate. After about an hour, I packed my things. I loaded the car. I locked the cabin. I drove home to Roanoke. I told Wesley, when I got home, that I had not been able to focus at the cabin and that I had decided to grade the essays at our kitchen table instead. He accepted this without question. He did not press me. He is the kind of man who lets people have their reasons. I called Wesley's mother that afternoon. Her name was Hazel, and she was, as I have said, in her 70s and lived in Charlottesville. She had always been a kind, warm woman, the kind of mother-in-law who had welcomed me into the family with the careful generosity of a woman who had wanted her son to be happy. We talked for a while about the small, ordinary things that I usually talked about with Hazel. The weather, Wesley's work, the fall colors in the Blue Ridge. After about 20 minutes, I asked her, in as casual a voice as I could manage, whether she could tell me anything about the history of the upstairs bedroom at the cabin, the larger one, with the picture window facing the lake. Hazel was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then she said, in a careful voice, "Honey, why do you ask?" I said, "I just wondered. I have been spending more time at the cabin, and I thought it would be nice to know more about its history." She said, "All right. The bedroom was my bedroom when I was a girl. It became the master bedroom after my parents died, and I inherited the cabin. My own mother, your husband's grandmother, refused to sleep in that bedroom for the last 20 years of her life. From about 1985 until she passed in 2005, when she stayed at the cabin, she always slept in the smaller bedroom, the one that is now the guest room. She never gave a clear reason for it. When I asked her about it once, in the late 1990s, she told me that the bedroom faced the wrong way and that she did not like the window. She would not say more. She went to her grave without saying more. I have wondered, sometimes, whether something happened to her in that bedroom that she did not want to talk about. I have wondered whether something happened to her there as a young woman, before she had the chance to become the careful private woman I knew. I do not know. I never asked her again. I have, in the years since I inherited the cabin, occasionally thought about her preference. I have continued to use the master bedroom myself when I stay at the cabin, and I have not had any difficulty with it. I am sorry, honey. Did something happen? I said no, nothing happened. I was just curious. Hazel was quiet on the line for another moment. Then she said, "All right, honey, let me know if you want me to call my cousin Ruth, who is older than I am, and who might remember more about the cabin's earlier years." I told her I would let her know. I never called her about it again. Wesley and I have continued to use the cabin, mostly together, mostly during the day, occasionally for short overnight stays. I have not, in the 5 years since that October weekend, slept in the upstairs master bedroom again. I have asked Wesley, casually, whether he would mind if we used the smaller bedroom going forward, on the grounds that I sleep better in smaller rooms. He has accepted the request without question. We use the guest bedroom now. I have not told him about the knocks. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that whoever was at that window in October of 2020 was not waiting for me specifically, and that the 3 soft, polite knocks were a small habitual ritual, that the thing on the other side of the glass has been performing for a long time, and that the quiet, careful way it stopped after 3 attempts was not a sign that it was patient, but a sign that it had a fixed ritual that it would not exceed. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that Wesley's grandmother heard the knocks too, in the years before, 1985, and that her decision to move to the smaller bedroom for the last 20 years of her life was the small, careful decision that I have now made. I do not know whether to believe my own hopes. The window is on the lakeside wall of the master bedroom. The glass is clean. The dust on the outside is undisturbed. I hope, when I am old, that I do not bring my own daughter to the cabin without telling her, casually but clearly, which bedroom to use. I hope she has the sense, as I had, to listen. I had been married to my wife Carol for about 28 years, by the summer of 2023, and I was 54 years old that July when we rented a large lake house on a quiet stretch of Appalachian shoreline in eastern Kentucky for a 4-day family reunion. My day job was as the comptroller of a regional construction company in Louisville, work I had done for almost 20 years and that I was about 3 years away from retiring from. Carol and I had 3 grown children, 2 of whom had children of their own by 2023, and the family reunion was a thing we had been trying to organize for several years, and that had finally come together that summer when everybody's schedules had aligned. There were 13 of us in total at the lake house. Carol and me, our 3 grown children and their spouses, 5 grandchildren ranging in age from 18 months to 9 years. The lake house was one of the larger rental properties in that part of the Blue Ridge country of eastern Kentucky, a 6-bedroom log cabin on a private cove on a small lake about 3 hours from Louisville, and I had paid the deposit on it the previous Christmas as a gift to the whole family. The lake itself was a small private impoundment that a regional mining company had built in the 1950s. The kind of small, remote Blue Ridge lake that had a few scattered private cabins along its shoreline, and not much else. The cove our cabin sat on was at the far north end of the lake, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound for about 4 miles up from the nearest paved highway. The cove was probably the most isolated piece of shoreline on the lake. The cabin had its own small wooden dock. There were no other cabins visible from the dock. There was no public access to the cove. The opposite shore of the cove, about 200 yards away across the dark water, was forested mountain land that the rental agency had told me was owned by a private timber company that had not logged that piece of property in decades. There was, by every detail the rental agency had provided and by every map I had looked at before booking, no other building of any kind on our cove. No cabin, no campground, no farmhouse, no road in to the opposite shore. The cove was, by every practical measure, ours alone for the 4 days we had rented it. The reunion went well. We arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. We spent the first 3 days the way large family reunions and lake houses go. We grilled supper. We swam off the dock in the long summer afternoons. The grandchildren spent hours catching small fish from the dock with the cheap plastic rods we had brought. Carol cooked her mother's biscuits one morning, and my daughter-in-law cooked her family's barbecue chicken another. We sat on the widescreen porch in the evenings with iced tea and beer, and we caught up on each other's lives. The cabin was full of the particular happy chaos of a family that had not been together in 3 years, and Carol and I, who had been the planners of the gathering, had the deep, tired satisfaction of two people who had pulled off something they had been trying to pull off for a long time. Saturday was our last full day at the cabin. We had planned to drive home on Sunday morning, with everybody loading their cars and heading off in their various directions back to Louisville and Lexington and Cincinnati, where my children and their families lived. Saturday evening was the last shared supper of the trip. We grilled again. We had a small, modest celebration on the back deck. The grandchildren stayed up later than they should have, the way grandchildren do on the last night of a family trip, running around the yard with sparklers in the dusk, while their parents pretended not to be tired. By about 10 o'clock, the youngest grandchildren had finally been put to bed in the upstairs bedrooms, and the older ones had followed not long after, and by about 10:30, Carol and our children and their spouses had all turned in for the night. With the long drive home in front of them and the slow, accumulated tiredness of the 4 days settling into all of them, I stayed up. I have always been a late evening person. I had a beer left in the cooler on the porch, and I had a small habit, on family vacations, of sitting alone on the porch for an hour after everybody else had gone to bed. With the last beer and the small, quiet pleasure of a man who had spent the day in a crowded house and who needed half an hour of solitude before sleep, I sat down in one of the wicker chairs on the screened porch. The porch faced the cove. The light from inside the cabin was dim, with most of the lights off, and only the small kitchen light visible through the windows behind me. The cove in front of me was completely dark, with no moon yet up and the shoreline of the opposite shore lost in the deep summer darkness. The lake was glass still. The cicadas were loud in the woods behind the cabin. I could hear the small ambient sounds of a lake at night. It was at about 11 o'clock, when I had been on the porch for maybe 20 minutes, that I first heard the children. I want to describe what I heard very precisely, because I have gone over the sounds many times in the 2 years since. The children's voices came from across the water, from somewhere on the opposite shore of the cove. The voices were the voices of 2 or maybe 3 children, the kind of clear, high, happy voices of kids who were playing in the shallows of a lake on a warm summer evening. I could hear laughter. I could hear the small splashing sounds of children kicking water and slapping it with their hands. I could hear what sounded like a small game being played, with the brief, excited shouts that small children make when they are competing with each other in the water. The voices were the voices of children who were maybe 5 or 6 and 7 years old, the age range of small kids who could play together in shallow water without adult supervision, but with the steady awareness that an adult was somewhere nearby. I sat in the wicker chair and I held my beer. I tried to think. The cove was completely dark. The opposite shore was, by every detail I had been able to verify before booking the cabin, undeveloped private timberland with no road in and no buildings of any kind. There was no campground for miles. The nearest public access to the lake was at the south end, 4 miles around the shoreline by water, and at least 8 or 9 miles by road. There was no possibility, by any normal mechanism, that small children were playing in the shallows of the opposite shore at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night in July. I listened. I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. I considered, in the first minute, whether the voices might be coming from somewhere else and I was misjudging the direction. Sound carries strangely over still water at night. I considered this carefully. I rejected it. I had been on lakes my entire life. I knew how to localize sounds across water. The voices were coming from across the cove. They were coming from a position approximately at the waterline of the opposite shore, in the small, dark strip of land where the trees came down to the water. The voices were not coming from above me or behind me, or from any other direction. They were coming from across the water. I considered whether the voices might be coming from another rental cabin somewhere along the shoreline that I had not been aware of. I had looked at the lake's shoreline carefully on the map before booking. There were no other cabins on the cove. The next cabin to the south, on the same shoreline as ours, was at least a mile away. The voices I was hearing were not faint or far. They were clear. They were close. They had the particular acoustic clarity of voices that are somewhere within 200 yards of a listener and that are not muffled by any intervening structure. I considered, finally, whether the voices might be the voices of a family that had hiked into the conservancy land on the opposite shore and was illegally camping with their small children on the shoreline. This was possible. It was also unlikely. The conservancy land was steep and difficult to access. The kind of family that would camp there with small children would almost certainly not let those children play in the shallows at 11 o'clock at night. And the voices were, by their character, the voices of children who were playing in well-known shallows that they had played in many times before, with the comfortable, casual energy of children at a familiar swimming spot, not the more careful exploratory energy of children who had hiked into an unfamiliar piece of wilderness. I sat on the porch and I listened. The voices continued. The pattern of the play did not change. The children were laughing and splashing and playing some kind of game with each other. I could not make out individual words. I could only make out the overall shape of the play. The voices did not move. They did not get louder. They did not get softer. They did not, in the 10 or 15 minutes I sat there listening, change their position along the shoreline. The children were in one specific spot on the opposite shore, and they were playing in that one specific spot, and they were not moving from it. After about 10 minutes, I heard the woman's voice. I want to describe the woman's voice. It came from somewhere on the same shore as the children, slightly back from the waterline, the way a mother's voice carries when she is calling from a porch or a cabin or a campsite back to children playing in front of her. The voice was a young woman's voice, the voice of a mother in maybe her late 20s or early 30s. She had the warm, tired tone of a mother who had been calling her children for some time and who was now starting to want them inside for the night. She called the children to come in. She told them, in a clear, carrying voice that I could hear plainly across the dark water, that it was getting late and that they needed to come inside now. The children laughed. They kept playing. The pattern of the splashing and the small, excited voices did not change. The mother called again. She called more firmly this time, the way a mother calls when her children have not responded to a first call and she is starting to lose patience with them. She told them, in the same clear, carrying voice, that it was time, that they had been playing long enough, that she was waiting for them. The children laughed. They kept playing. The splashing continued. The voices did not change. The mother called a third time. The third call had the small, careful weariness of a mother who had made this exact call many times in her life, the kind of weariness that mothers develop when they have been calling their children at bedtime for years and have learned to expect that the children will not come in until the third or fourth call. There was no anger in her voice. There was no panic. There was the tired, patient firmness of a mother who knew her children would eventually come in the way they always did, and who was simply going to keep calling until they did. The children did not come in. I sat on the porch and I listened. The mother kept calling. The children kept playing. The pattern repeated itself in the slow, careful way of a small domestic ritual that I was overhearing from a position I should not have been overhearing it from, on a shore where there was no cabin and no road in and no campground for miles. I want to describe what I understood as I listened. I understood that the children were not going to come in. I understood that the mother was not going to stop calling. I understood that the small domestic scene I was hearing across the water had been going on for some time before I sat down on the porch, and that it was going to continue for some time after I went inside. I understood, in the slow way that an understanding sometimes comes to a man sitting alone in the dark, that the children and the mother were not on the opposite shore in any way that I would be able to verify if I went down to the dock with my flashlight or paddled across in the morning to look. I understood that the cove had a small private routine that was being performed at 11 o'clock at night on a stretch of undeveloped shoreline where no children should have been, and that I was not the audience for the routine, and that I should finish my beer and go inside. I went inside. I want to admit that I did not finish my beer. I left the half-full bottle on the small wicker side table on the porch. I closed the screen porch door behind me. I locked the door. I had not locked the porch door at any other time during our 4 days at the cabin. I locked it that night. I went up the small wooden staircase to the bedroom Carol and I were sharing on the second floor. Carol was asleep, breathing the slow, steady breath of a woman who had spent the day with 5 grandchildren and who was deeply tired. I got into bed. I lay on my back. I tried to think about something else. I could still, very faintly, hear the children laughing across the water through the closed window of the bedroom. I could hear, every minute or so, the small, worn, carrying call of the mother asking them to come in. The children were still playing. The mother was still calling. I lay in bed, and I waited for the sounds to stop. I do not know exactly when they stopped, because I do not know exactly when I fell asleep. I know that the sounds were still there when I closed my eyes. The next morning, the lake was completely silent. I want to describe this. I woke up at about 6. The cove outside the bedroom window was glass still in the gray pre-dawn light. There were no voices. There was no splashing. There was no sound coming from the opposite shore. The cove had returned to the quiet, remote stretch of Appalachian shoreline that the rental agency had described in its listing. I went down to the kitchen. I made coffee. Nobody else was up yet. I sat at the kitchen table, and I drank my coffee, and I tried to make sense of what I had heard. I considered telling Carol. I considered telling my children. I decided not to. I decided that the sounds I had heard the night before were a thing that I had heard alone, and that telling my family would do nothing for any of them, and would only put a small, careful unease into the memory of a family reunion that they had loved. Carol had wanted that reunion for years. The grandchildren had loved their 4 days at the cabin. I had no intention of putting a shadow over any of it. The family woke up over the next 2 hours. We had breakfast. We packed our cars. We took our small, careful goodbye photographs in front of the cabin. We drove home in our various directions. Carol and I drove back to Louisville together, and we talked about the trip the whole way, and I did not mention what I had heard. In the 2 years since, I have not told anyone about the children on the opposite shore. I have not gone back to the cabin. The rental agency sent me an email the following spring offering me a discount on a return booking. I did not respond. They sent another email a few months later. I did not respond to that one either. I have hoped, on the bad nights when I cannot sleep, that the children on the opposite shore are not lonely, and that the mother who calls them in is somebody they love, and that the small domestic ritual of bedtime calls and laughing refusals to come in is a thing they have been doing together for a long time, and that nobody on either shore needs to interfere with it. I have hoped, on the worst nights, that the children eventually do come in, that the mother is eventually answered, that the routine, somehow, comes to an end. I do not know whether to believe my own hopes. The cove sits at the north end of a small lake in eastern Kentucky. The opposite shore is undeveloped private timberland. There is no cabin. There is no campground. There is no road in. There are children, sometimes, on summer nights, playing in the shallows. There is a young mother, sometimes, calling from somewhere back from the waterline, asking them to come inside. I hope, if anyone else rents that cabin, that they have the sense to lock the porch door. I hope they do not call out across the water. I hope, most of all, that the children stay on their own shore.